Kanto holds its secrets the way old maps hold their edges, quietly, without announcement, waiting for someone to look closely enough to notice what was always there. The first region ever explored in a Pokémon game carries more history than any single playthrough could reveal, a layered world built on choices, constraints, and a creative spirit that shaped everything that followed. And before we drift any further, settle in as we begin tonight's relaxing journey through the world of Pokémon. If this helps you unwind, subscribe to join the Cozy Club. There are 151 Pokémon in the Kanto region, a number that once felt enormous and now carries the warmth of something deeply familiar. Each one began as a sketch, a thought, a possibility held in someone's hands before becoming permanent. Kanto was not the first idea. The region that players came to know through Pokémon Red and Green, released in Japan in February of 1996, emerged from years of development guided by one person's particular fascination with collecting insects as a child. Satoshi Tajiri grew up in the Machida area of Tokyo during a time when the city's outskirts still held patches of wild land. Streams and vacant lots near his home were full of beetles, dragonflies, and caterpillars, and Tajiri spent hours catching and studying them. As development slowly consumed those spaces, the creatures became harder to find, and that loss stayed with him. When he eventually began designing a game, the act of searching for and collecting living things became the central mechanic, a way of preserving in digital form the kind of wonder those childhood afternoons had carried. The Game Boy itself played a crucial role in shaping what Kanto would become. When Tajiri and his collaborator, Ken Sugimori, first approached Nintendo with the concept, the hardware they were designing for was already aging. The Game Boy had launched in 1989, and by the time Pokémon Red and Green arrived, it had been on the market for nearly 7 years. Other developers had largely moved on to newer hardware, but the Game Boy's link cable feature, which allowed two devices to connect and exchange data, gave Tajiri exactly what he needed. The idea of trading creatures between games could not have existed without that small, humble connector. It transformed a single-player experience into a social one, giving children in schoolyards and at kitchen tables a reason to gather around something and share. Development took 6 years. That span of time is worth sitting with for a moment, because it represents not just labor, but uncertainty. There were moments when the project nearly ended, when funding ran dry, and the small team at Game Freak continued working without pay. Ken Sugimori, who designed every original Pokémon by hand with pen and paper, created creature after creature, not knowing if they would ever appear on a screen held by another person. The original designs went through multiple rounds of revision, with some creatures changing shape substantially between their first sketch and their final sprite. Others arrived nearly complete from the beginning, their forms so natural and inevitable that they seemed less like inventions and more like discoveries. Pikachu was not always the face of the franchise. In the earliest promotional materials and internal discussions, Clefairy held a more prominent position. The small pink fairy Pokémon had qualities that the team believed would appeal broadly: a round shape, large eyes, and a cheerful demeanor that leaned into the kind of softness associated with toys and stuffed animals. Some early manga adaptations of the series featured Clefairy rather than Pikachu as the primary companion, a creative choice that now feels like a glimpse into a version of the franchise that never fully arrived. The shift happened because of the anime. When the television series was being developed alongside the games, producers made the decision to pair the protagonist, known internationally as Ash, with a Pikachu rather than a Clefairy. The reasoning was partly visual. Pikachu's yellow coloring read more clearly on the kinds of television screens common in homes during the mid-1990s, and its simple, rounded shape translated well into animation. Clefairy's pink worked less reliably across different display technologies of that era, and its design, while charming, carried a slightly more passive energy than the Electric Mouse's alert, expressive face. Once Pikachu became the star of the anime, the games followed. Pokémon Yellow, released in Japan in September of 1998 and internationally the following year, was built around that connection. The player began not with a choice of Bulbasaur, Charmander, or Squirtle, but with a Pikachu that refused to enter its Pokeball and instead followed along behind on the overworld map. It was a small change mechanically, but emotionally it was significant. Players were no longer just carrying a team. They were walking beside a companion, and that distinction mattered in ways the series would return to again and again across to later generations. The original 151 Pokémon were not created all at once. Sugimori worked through the roster gradually, drawing inspiration from biology, mythology, folklore, and everyday objects. Some designs began with a clear concept and arrived quickly. Others evolved through many drafts before settling into a form that felt right. The process was not entirely systematic, and the final collection reflects that organic quality, containing creatures as different in spirit as the ghostly Gengar and the grounded Geodude, the soaring Aerodactyl, and the humble Caterpie. Caterpie itself holds an interesting place in that original roster. As one of the first Pokémon players could realistically catch in Viridian Forest during the early hours of a playthrough, it served as many trainers' introduction to the experience of watching a captured creature grow and change. Caterpie could evolve into Metapod after reaching level 7, a transformation that took very little time compared to later evolutions. And Metapod would become Butterfree at level 10, a fully realized butterfly with wings patterned in soft blue and white. The speed of that evolution arc was intentional, designed to demonstrate the game's central loop quickly and reward new players before they had a chance to lose interest. What made Butterfree more than just a tutorial creature was its enduring presence in both the games and the anime. In one of the most remembered episodes of the original series, Ash released his Butterfree so it could join a migration of its kind and find a mate. The episode aired when many viewers were young, and the quiet sadness of watching a beloved companion fly away left an impression that has stayed with the franchise's culture for decades. The moment worked because the relationship between trainer and Pokémon had been built carefully over many episodes, and the farewell felt earned. It remains a reference point in discussions about emotional storytelling within the series, a reminder that even within a world designed around collection and battle, the bonds formed along the way carried their own weight. Brock's gym in Pewter City was the first major test players faced, and its design communicated something important about the region's philosophy. The gym leader used rock-type Pokémon, creatures that were physically strong and resistant to many early-game attack types. A player who had only trained their starter would find the battle difficult, so sometimes impossible. This was not an accident. The gym's design encouraged the player to engage more broadly with the world around them, to catch additional Pokémon, and build a more varied team. Brock himself was drawn as a capable, experienced trainer, and his dialogue carried a gruff confidence that made defeating him feel meaningful. The victory felt earned in a way that the early routes thus had not quite managed to deliver. The gym badge system that Brock introduced has remained a core structure of the series ever since. 8 badges collected from 8 gym leaders, each with their own type specialty and personality, before a challenge at the Pokémon League. Kanto established that template and gave every future region something to work with or work against. The gyms of later generations would occasionally subvert the formula by introducing unexpected types, unusual formats, or unconventional leaders, but they always did so in dialogue with the structure that Pewter City first made familiar. Misty's gym in Cerulean City arrived next, and her specialization in water-type Pokémon created a natural counter to Brock's strengths. Players who had kept Pikachu from Viridian Forest would find unexpected advantage here. Electric attacks were strong against water types, and that matchup rewarded players who had diversified their team rather than releasing or storing the small mouse after the early roots. The design created a sense of continuity across gyms, suggesting that each decision made earlier in the journey could carry consequences or benefits further along. Lavender Town sits near the middle of the Kanto map, and its atmosphere differs noticeably from the towns surrounding it. Where other locations feel open and inhabited by the energy of commerce or nature, Lavender Town is quiet in a particular way. The buildings are muted, the pathways feel narrower, and the Pokémon Tower at the center of the settlement holds the graves of Pokémon who have died. It is the region's most explicit acknowledgement that the creatures within the world are mortal, that the journey involves loss as well as discovery. The music associated with Lavender Town became the subject of considerable discussion in the years following the game's release. The composition used unusual harmonics and a higher frequency range than other tracks in the game, creating a sound that many players described as unsettling without being able to articulate exactly why. Some of that effect was genuine, a result of the way the Game Boy's sound chip rendered certain tones. Others were amplified by the legend that naturally builds around anything perceived as strange in a beloved piece of media. Whatever the truth of specific claims made about the music over the years, the fact remains that Lavender Town's atmosphere was distinctive enough to generate lasting conversation, which speaks to how carefully its design had been considered. The ghost-type Pokémon that inhabited Pokémon Tower could not be seen or interacted with without the Sylph Scope, a key item obtained from Team Rocket's headquarters in Celadon City. Players who wandered into the tower before acquiring it encountered only a message describing the presence of something that could not quite be made out. It was one of the game's more subtle pieces of environmental storytelling, communicating the idea that some things remained hidden until the right tool or knowledge had been gathered. Obtaining the Sylph Scope did not diminish the atmosphere of the tower. If anything, it deepened it, because now the shapeless presence had a name and a face, and the act of battling these revealed spirits carried its own quiet gravity. Gengar is the ghost that most players encountered first in Pokémon Tower, and its design carries layers of detail that are easy to overlook in the speed of battle. The creature is shadow purple, rounded in a way that suggests something deflated or flattened rather than fully solid. Its wide grin and half-closed eyes communicate not quite malice, but something closer to comfortable mischief, the expression of a creature that has made peace with what it is. Gengar's Pokédex entries across various games describe it as the shadow of a Clefable, a connection that has fascinated fans for decades. Whether this was intended as a literal design link or simply a poetic description of how darkness mirrors light, the parallel between the cheerful pink fairy and the grinning purple ghost says something interesting about how the original designers thought about balance within their creature roster. Gengar evolves from Haunter through a trade, meaning that players who wanted the final form needed either a second Game Boy, a link cable, and a friend willing to assist, or access to one of the relatively rare trading events held at certain retail locations during the game's early years. The trade evolution mechanic was clever for several reasons. It encouraged the social behavior that the link cable was designed to facilitate, rewarded players who formed real-world connections around the game, and made certain evolutions feel genuinely special. A Gengar in a player's party was not just a strong Pokémon. It was evidence of a relationship, proof that someone had helped them get there. Haunter, the mid-stage evolution between Ghastly and Gengar, became the subject of a famous episode of the anime in which Ash borrowed one from a haunted mansion to help against Sabrina's psychic team in Saffron City. The haunter that agreed to join him turned out to be more interested in comedy than combat, and the episode played the situation for gentle humor before arriving at an emotional resolution. It was the kind of storytelling the original series did well, using the creatures' individual personalities to drive narrative in ways that the game's mechanical presentation could not quite achieve. The Sylph Company building in Saffron City presented players with the game's largest dungeon, a multi-floor office building occupied by Team Rocket following a hostile takeover. The building's layout required players to navigate a series of warp tiles that connected different floors in non-linear ways, creating a puzzle that many found genuinely disorienting. The reward for navigating it successfully was a confrontation with Giovanni, the organization's leader, followed by an encounter with the game's most famous legendary Pokémon. Mewtwo did not appear in Sylph Company directly, but the narrative threads connecting Team Rocket's ambitions to the creation of that creature began to take shape within those corridors. Team Rocket itself was presented as more than a generic enemy force. Giovanni's role as both the villain running a criminal organization and secretly the 8th gym leader of Kanto added a layer of dramatic irony to the final gym battle. Players who reached Viridian City's gym near the end of their journey found that the leader, who had been absent at the beginning, had now returned, and that defeating him would close a loop that the narrative had quietly been drawing since the first hours of the game. It was a storytelling choice that rewarded attentive players and gave the final gym encounter a weight that pure mechanical challenge alone could not have produced. The relationship between Team Rocket's ambitions and the region's legendary creatures was never made fully explicit in the original games, relying instead on fragments of Pokédex text, overheard NPC dialogue, and environmental suggestion. Players learned about Mewtwo through a journal found in the ruins of a laboratory on Cinnabar Island, a document that described in careful, clinical language the process by which a fossil sample of Mew had been used to create something new. The text did not dramatize its subject. It simply recorded it in the tone of someone who had done something and noted the results. That restraint made the discovery feel more unsettling than any dramatic presentation might have managed. Mew's place in Kanto's mythology is unlike that of any other Pokémon in the original roster. The creature was added to the game data late in development, slipped into the code by programmer Shigeki Morimoto with the knowledge of almost no one else on the team. The file size for Mew was small enough that it fit within space that had technically already been allocated for something else, meaning it existed in the game without officially occupying resources anyone had noticed were free. When it was discovered through a glitch involving a specific sequence of actions in the region known as the Missing No encounter area, the response from players was immediate and intense. The glitch that allowed players to encounter Mew legitimately in the game was never supposed to exist. It involved speaking to a specific NPC, walking in a particular direction, and then engaging in a battle that reset certain game flags incorrectly, causing the area's wild encounter data to pull from a location in memory that happened to contain Mew's data. The fact that this worked at all was an accident of how the game's data was organized, but it spread through schoolyards and neighborhoods with the speed and energy of genuine treasure. Children who had heard about it but not yet tried it spent days attempting to replicate the steps, and those who succeeded carried the story with the quiet pride of someone who had found something real. Official confirmation of Mew's existence came through promotional events in Japan, where the creature was distributed at Nintendo-sponsored gatherings to players who brought their cartridges. The scarcity of those events and the impossibility of attending them for most players outside Japan meant that Mew remained genuinely rare in many parts of the world for years. It was one of the first examples in gaming of a creature designed specifically to exist at the edge of what was accessible, present in the code, but withheld from ordinary play, available only to those who found the right moment or the right method. Cinnabar Island sits at the southwestern edge of the Kanto map and holds more history per square tile than perhaps any other location in the region. The Pokémon Mansion at its center is a burned-out structure, its interior filled with overturned furniture, wild Pokémon, and the scattered journals that document the creation of Mewtwo. The gym on the island is run by Blaine, a fire-type specialist who presents himself with theatrical confidence and a love of riddles. His gym uses a quiz format that allows players to bypass trainers by answering questions correctly, a design that stands apart from every other gym in the region for its willingness to engage players' knowledge rather than only their battle strategy. The fossil Pokémon that could be revived at Cinnabar's laboratory added another dimension to the island's identity. Players who had found either the Dome fossil or the Helix fossil earlier in their journey could bring it here and receive a living creature in return. Omanite, revived from the Helix, was a small spiral-shelled creature with tentacles and wide, quiet eyes. Kabuto, revived from the Dome, was lower and flatter, a creature shaped like something that had learned to press close to the ocean floor. Both were water and rock type, ancient designs that felt genuinely different from the creatures native to the region, carrying the texture of deep time in their silhouettes. Aerodactyl, revived from old amber found in the Pewter Museum, was a flying and rock type, a creature that carried the energy of something prehistoric, restored to uncomfortable life. Its design was jagged and open-mouthed, suggesting speed and aggression. Pokédex entries described it as a vicious creature that had torn apart enemies with its serrated fangs. The combination of fossil origin and predatory description gave it a quality that most Kanto Pokémon did not carry, a sense of something genuinely wild being temporarily contained within the structures of a Pokéball. The Safari Zone north of Fuchsia City was one of Kanto's most unusual gameplay spaces, a region where normal battle mechanics did not apply. Players entered with a limited number of steps and a collection of rocks and bait, neither of which were tools the game had introduced before. Throwing rocks at a Pokémon made it more likely to flee, but easier to catch. Throwing bait reduced its escape tendency, but made it less susceptible to capture. The balance between these mechanics was deliberately imprecise, creating a catching experience built around uncertainty rather than optimized strategy. Players who spent time in the Safari Zone often left with a Scyther or a Pinsir depending on their version, and occasionally a Kangaskhan, a creature so rare within that space that finding one felt like a genuine event. Kangaskhan's design held a quiet detail that generations of players noticed and wondered about. The adult creature carried a young Joey in its pouch, a biological fact that the game acknowledged through its appearance but never fully explained. Pokédex entries noted that the young Kangaskhan spent its early years in the pouch, only venturing out to practice fighting moves under the parent's supervision. The mystery that emerged from this design was the question of what a young Kangaskhan actually was, whether it was the same species in miniature or something that aged into the adult form. That question received a kind of answer in later generations, though the original games left it open, allowing it to become one of those gentle puzzles that players carried with them between playthroughs. Scyther and Pinsir existed in the Safari Zone as version-exclusive counterparts, each available only in one game. Scyther was found in Pokémon Red and Pinsir in Pokémon Blue, a distinction that reinforced the design philosophy of making each version of the game feel genuinely different from the other. The creatures themselves were visually opposite in energy. Scyther was elongated and aerodynamic, its blade-like arms suggesting precision and speed. Pinsir was broad and armored, its great pincers suggesting strength and grip. Neither could evolve in the original generation, a fact that later games addressed in ways that gave both creatures new narrative chapters while preserving the qualities that had made them distinct to begin with. Eevee was given to the player by a man in the back room of the Celadon City Hotel, a quiet transaction that introduced one of the most conceptually interesting Pokémon in the original roster. The creature that received a gift, Eevee held something unique in their hands, a Pokémon that could become one of 3 different things, depending on which evolutionary stone was used. Vaporeon emerged from the Water Stone, a liquid-looking creature whose body seemed to blur at the edges as though it were not quite solid. Jolteon emerged from the Thunderstone, electric and sharp, its fur standing in rigid points. Flareon emerged from the Firestone, warm and rounded, its thick collar of fur giving it the look of something perpetually comfortable. Each evolution emphasized a different aesthetic and elemental identity, while all 3 shared the same origin. The concept underlying Eevee was explicitly about potential, about the idea that the same starting point could lead to fundamentally different outcomes, depending on what it encountered along the way. The original 3 evolutions covered 3 of the 4 traditional classical elements, leaving water, thunder, and fire represented while notably omitting something like earth or wind or ice. Later generations would expand the line considerably, adding evolutions tied to other types, and introducing the idea that some transformations required not a stone, but a specific emotional or environmental condition. The original 3, though, captured something essential about the concept, and Eevee became one of the franchise's most enduring designs because of how cleanly the branching evolution communicated the idea of possibility. The Pokémon League at the end of Victory Road sat at the northeastern tip of Kanto, accessible only after collecting all 8 gym badges and navigating a cave system filled with experienced trainers and strong, wild Pokémon. The Elite Four who waited within were presented as the strongest trainers in the region, each specialized in a single type, and each representing a genuine spike in difficulty for players who had not prepared thoroughly. Lorelei used ice types, their cold logic and defensive resilience making them difficult to overcome without a targeted strategy. Bruno used fighting types, powerful and physically imposing. Agatha used ghost types, and her affection for trickery and status conditions made her encounters feel different in kind from the preceding 2. Lance used dragon types, and the rarity of dragon moves in the original games made his team genuinely formidable even for players who had prepared carefully. The champion who waited beyond Lance was a player with whom the journey had begun, but whose path had diverged somewhere along the way. Blue, the rival in Pokémon Red, and Blue had traveled the same route, collected the same badges, and arrived first. Finding him in the champion's seat, rather than another unfamiliar trainer, was one of the game's most effective narrative choices, giving the final battle a personal dimension that pure challenge could not have supplied. The relationship between the player and the rival had been established early and maintained throughout, with unexpected encounters at key moments across the journey. The final confrontation resolved something that had been building since the very first steps out of Pallet Town. After defeating Blue, the player was led to a Hall of Fame sequence where their team was registered in the game's records. It was a quiet ceremony for such a significant accomplishment, a simple fanfare and a screen of text that recorded the names and levels of the Pokémon who had completed the journey. The understatement felt appropriate, consistent with the way the game had always treated its most important moments, allowing them to breathe without excessive dramatization. The Pokémon that populated Kanto's routes were not distributed randomly. Each route had its own encounter table, a list of Pokémon that could appear there, and the frequency with which each would show up. Some creatures were common enough that players found them almost immediately. Rattata appeared on early routes at such high frequency that it became a byword for something unremarkable. Spearow was similarly ubiquitous in the air above open fields. Others were rare enough that players could spend hours on a particular route without encountering them. Chansey, found in the Safari Zone and a few other locations, had an encounter rate so low that finding one was a matter of patient waiting, and its high experience yield when defeated made it a destination for trainers willing to commit the time. The distribution of rare and common Pokémon across routes created a geography of excitement within the region. Certain locations became known for what they might yield. Seafoam Islands, the cave system reached by surfing along the southern coast, held the legendary bird Articuno deep within its icy chambers. The power plant along the eastern coast harbored Zapdos among the machinery and electrical conduits, and Moltres waited in Victory Road, the final cave before the Pokémon League, available to players who were already close to the end of their journey. Each legendary bird occupied a location that resonated thematically with its element, and their rarity, appearing only once in each save file, made encounters with them feel genuinely unrepeatable. Articuno was the first legendary bird most players encountered if they chose to explore Seafoam Islands before pressing toward the Pokémon League. The cave required navigating a puzzle involving boulders and water currents, pushing large rocks into holes in the floor to slow the current enough to reach deeper chambers. The effort required before reaching the bird gave the encounter a quality that simpler discoveries could not match. Players who arrived in the chamber where Articuno waited had invested something in getting there, and the creature itself, pale blue and symmetrical, with long tail feathers that extended far behind it, looked like something that belonged to a space between things, between water and air, between stillness and motion. The legendary birds shared a design philosophy that emphasized elemental clarity over complexity. Articuno was immediately cold, Zapdos was immediately electric, and Moltres was immediately fiery, their colorways and silhouettes communicating their natures before any Pokédex text was consulted. This directness was a feature of many original Kanto designs, a willingness to make visual communication the primary goal rather than layering in obscure references or requiring external knowledge to appreciate. What you saw was largely what you got, and within that clarity there was still room for beauty. Zapdos, in particular, carried a design quality that distinguished it from the other two birds. Where Articuno was smooth and Moltres was broad, Zapdos was angular, its feathers depicted as sharp spikes extending in multiple directions. The overall silhouette was almost chaotic, a creature that looked like it had been struck by lightning and simply absorbed the disruption into its own structure. Its appearance in the power plant, surrounded by the skeletal remains of machines and the glow of scattered electric energy, created an atmosphere unlike any other legendary encounter in the region. The original starters, Bulbasaur, Charmander, and Squirtle, were given to the player by Professor Oak at the very beginning of the journey, a moment whose simplicity has been replicated in some form in every mainline Pokémon game since. The choice felt consequential in ways that first-time players could not fully evaluate. Each starter offered a different relationship to the gym types ahead. Charmander, a fire type, faced genuine difficulty against the first two gyms, which used rock and water types against which fire attacks were at a disadvantage. Players who chose Charmander were implicitly committing to a harder early game in exchange for a starter whose final evolution, Charizard, carried an aerodynamic power and visual appeal that made it worth the investment. Bulbasaur offered the opposite trade. Its grass and poison typing was effective against both Brock and Misty, making the early game easier than the other choices. But as the journey progressed, the types that resisted or countered grass became more numerous, and Venusaur's final form, while genuinely capable, lacked the charismatic immediacy of the fire and water alternatives. Players who chose Bulbasaur often did so with a kind of quiet confidence, selecting the creature that made practical sense rather than the one that promised spectacle. Squirtle began from a position of balance. Its water typing was disadvantaged against Brock's rock team, but effective against Blaine's fire gym and others along the way. Its evolutions, Wartortle and Blastoise, emphasized defensive bulk alongside offensive capability, and Blastoise's design, with large water cannons mounted on its shell, communicated something about utility and deliberate power that felt different from Charizard's expressive aggression or Venusaur's organic mass. The choice between the three starters defined not just the early hours of a playthrough, but often something about the player's own preferences and instincts, a small self-portrait painted in the moment before the adventure truly began. Mewtwo was the creature waiting at the end of the game's largest optional dungeon, the Cerulean Cave north of Cerulean City, accessible only after becoming champion. The cave itself offered no story context beyond what the player already knew from the Cinnabar Mansion journals, no NPC to warn about what waited inside, no build-up beyond the challenge of navigating the cave's layout. Mewtwo simply existed there, at level 70, the highest of any catchable Pokémon in the original games, surrounded by the ordinary sounds of a cave in the way that something extraordinary so often arrives without ceremony. The design of Mewtwo communicated artificiality more directly than almost any other creature in the roster. Where natural Pokémon seemed to have emerged from their environments, shaped by evolutionary pressures into their various forms, Mewtwo looked like something assembled, its proportions deliberate rather than organic, its expressions settled into something that was neither calm nor distressed, but simply present. The two small nubs on its head recalled the rounded ears of Mew while remaining distinct, and the long purple tail that extended behind it had the quality of something added to a design rather than grown from one. These details were not accidental. Mewtwo was supposed to look created, because within the narrative it was. Catching Mewtwo required the Master Ball, a single Pokéball with a guaranteed catch rate that was obtained from the Sylph Company president following the building's liberation from Team Rocket. Players who had spent their Master Ball on another Pokémon before reaching Cerulean Cave faced a significantly more challenging encounter, required to use ordinary Pokéballs and Ultra Balls against a creature whose high level and powerful moves made the battle genuinely difficult. The catch was always possible but never certain, and the uncertainty was part of what made it feel like an ending worthy of the journey. The routes connecting Kanto's towns carried their own quiet personalities. Route 1, the first path walked in the game, was short and gentle, populated by Pidgey and Rattata, its tall grass offering the first opportunity to throw a Pokéball. Route 2 introduced the idea of cut-down trees blocking paths, teaching players that certain obstacles required specific tools to clear. Route 3 connected Pewter to Mount Moon, and Mount Moon itself was the first true dungeon of the game, a cave system filled with trainers and wild Pokémon, and the recurring presence of Team Rocket members hunting for fossils. The fossils themselves could be found in Mount Moon's deepest chamber, a moment of quiet choice that the game presented with minimal fanfare. A super nerd waited there, in possessions of both a dome fossil and a helix fossil, and would offer the player one of the two before taking the other for himself. The player could not obtain both without trading or using certain external methods, and the difference between Omanate and Kabuto was real enough that the choice carried weight. Both fossils told a story through their names and later their creatures about ancient ocean life, about things that had persisted through deep time into a world that had moved far beyond the seas they had originally inhabited. Route 6, the path between Cerulean and Vermilion City, passed near a gatehouse where a Pokemon could briefly be glimpsed through a truck. This image, a large truck parked near an otherwise unremarkable piece of scenery, became the center of one of the original game's most persistent rumors. Players circulated stories about what could be found if the truck were pushed aside, claiming that a powerful or secret Pokemon waited beneath it. The rumors were false, but the fact that they spread so widely and lasted so long speaks to something about the atmosphere of the original Kanto games, the sense that any corner of the world might hold something unexpected, that exploration might reward the patient and the curious with discoveries that no guide had yet documented. The Game Corner in Celadon City offered players a chance to exchange coins for Pokemon that could not easily be found in the wild, including Dratini and Porygon. Dratini was the first stage in what would become one of the game's most coveted evolution lines. A small, pale dragon that grew slowly toward Dragonair and eventually Dragonite. Its early form gave no visual indication of the power it would develop, looking instead like a gentle, serpentine creature suited to still water rather than open sky. The patience required to raise it through its slow evolution arc was part of what made the final evolution feel earned. Porygon was something else entirely. The creature described as the world's first artificially created Pokemon. It existed within the game as a digital entity, its body composed of polygonal shapes that suggested computer modeling rather than biological development. Its design was ahead of its time in the sense that it was explicitly self-referential, a Pokemon that was a program running inside a game, acknowledging the nature of its own existence in a way that other creatures did not. Later evolutions would expand on that concept in unexpected directions, but the original Porygon carried the concept cleanly, its flat-colored surfaces and geometric body being its own commentary on what it was. The Game Corner itself had a connection to Team Rocket that players discovered when exploring the building's back rooms and basement. The coins being gambled with on the surface were covering something less visible below, and the encounter with a hidden lift requiring a particular key item revealed the organization's presence within ordinary-looking commercial spaces. It was a design choice that made Celadon feel like a place with layers, where the cheerful surface of a department store and a game hall could conceal something that required investigation to understand. Bill's lighthouse on the eastern coast of Kanto, near Cerulean, was home to one of the game's more unusual encounters. Bill, the Pokemon storage system developer whose PC-based infrastructure allowed trainers to hold more than 6 Pokemon at a time, had accidentally fused with a Pokemon during one of his experiments. Players arrived to find him in the form of the creature, requiring them to activate a device that restored him to his human state before he could offer thanks and the passage to the SS Anne. The moment was brief and played without significant drama, but it introduced an idea that the game did not pursue further, that the technology connecting humans to Pokemon was intimate enough to blur the boundaries between them. The SS Anne was a luxury ocean liner docked at Vermilion City, accessible through the use of a ticket obtained from Bill. Aboard the ship, players moved through corridors of trainers and passengers, eventually reaching the captain's quarters, where the seasick captain was recovered enough to provide the ability to cut down trees. It was one of the game's cleaner examples of quest design, a chain of interactions leading to a tool that opened new areas elsewhere. The ship itself left Vermilion after the player's visit and did not return, which created a soft time pressure for players who had heard there were rare items aboard and wanted to find them before the departure. Lieutenant Surge, The gym leader waiting in Vermilion City used electric-type Pokémon behind a locked door that required finding 2 hidden switches in a sequence that changed with each playthrough. The gym itself was designed to feel military, its layout reflecting Surge's background as a wartime pilot who had credited electric Pokémon with saving his life. The story gave him a specificity that most gym leaders in the original games did not receive, a personal history that explained the intensity with which he approached his specialty. Defeating him and taking the Thunder Badge opened a path forward, while also providing access to the strength ability used for pushing boulders in later dungeons. The Sylph Scope, once obtained, revealed the identities of the ghost Pokémon in Pokémon Tower. Chief among them was the spirit of a Marowak, a creature distinguished from ordinary Marowak by the fact that it could not be caught. The ghost appeared as an apparition whose wild encounter prompt appeared, but whose Pokéball throws passed through it without effect, making clear that this was not a standard encounter, but something else entirely. The Marowak's presence in the tower was connected to the narrative of a young Cubone below, a creature that wore its dead mother's skull as a helmet and carried a bone as a weapon. The connection between the grieving Cubone and the ghost above, it was never stated directly but implied clearly enough that players constructed it themselves. The storyline within Pokémon Tower was one of the original game's quieter emotional achievements, built from almost entirely environmental pieces rather than dialogue or dramatic scenes. A Cubone in Lavender Town, a ghost that could not be caught. Team Rocket members on the floors above, hunting for Pokémon parts of value. The absence of a mother, communicated only through what the child carried and what floated above the graves. None of these pieces demanded acknowledgement. They simply existed together, allowing players who noticed them to feel something that the game had not asked them to feel, which is often the most effective kind of emotional design. The Cubone that waited in Lavender Town would eventually leave with the player if they chose to add it to their team, and would in time grow into a Marowak. The evolution changed the creature's proportions while preserving its mourning. The skull helmet and bone weapon carried forward into a form that was larger, more capable, and still marked by what had been lost. It was the kind of design choice that rewarded players who stayed with a creature through its growth, who saw the transformation and recognized that the new form had not erased the earlier one, but incorporated it. Saffron City was Kanto's largest metropolitan center, a place of tall buildings and organized streets that reflected the region's most urban sensibility. It housed both the Sylph Company and the psychic-type gym led by Sabrina, a character whose design suggested someone who existed slightly outside the ordinary social world of the region. Sabrina's introduction in the anime depicted a lonely childhood in which her psychic abilities had separated her from other children, an origin that gave her adult persona a quiet melancholy. In the games, she appeared simply as a powerful trainer whose Pokémon were difficult to counter, but the anime's expansion of her character gave the gym encounter a resonance it might not otherwise have carried. Psychic types in the original generation were famously powerful, benefiting from a damage calculation quirk that made many of their moves more effective than they were intended to be. Ghost types were supposed to resist Psychic in the original design, but a coding error left Ghost moves with no effect on Psychic types, rather than being super effective, meaning that the one type supposed to counter Psychic was actually unable to touch it. This meant that players facing Sabrina's team needed to rely on bug moves, which were available but weak, or simply overpower her through raw level advantage. The balance issue was not corrected until later generations, but it gave the Saffron City gym a difficulty spike that players who struggled there have described as formative. The psychic type itself, despite its computational quirks, was visually represented in Kanto by a range of creatures that communicated different aspects of mental power. Abra was famously difficult to catch because it used teleport to escape immediately, requiring either a Pokeball thrown before it could act, or the use of a move that prevented fleeing. Kadabra, its evolution, was a tall, humanoid creature that carried bent spoons as a visual symbol of psychokinetic ability, a design that was also the subject of a legal dispute with a well-known illusionist whose stage name it was alleged to resemble. Alakazam, the final form, held 2 spoons and was described in Pokédex entries as having an IQ of 5,000, a number so extravagant that it said something about the original writer's comfort with hyperbole in service of characterization. Erica in Celadon City used grass-type Pokémon with a gentle, cultivated elegance. Her gym styled as a garden where trainers could be found tending to plants between battles. Her design suggested a person who had found deep satisfaction in the slower rhythms of growth and care, and the grass-type specialty reinforced that impression. The creatures she used, including Victreebel and Tangela, communicated the complexity of plant life in different ways. Victreebel was predatory in the way that certain carnivorous plants are, its wide mouth designed for capture rather than bloom. Tangela was obscure and covered, its body entirely hidden beneath a mass of interwoven blue vines that left only its feet and eyes visible. The gym in Celadon also contained a notable accessibility quirk, a back entrance that allowed players to bypass several trainers by entering through a gap in the gym's southern wall rather than the front door. This was not a glitch, but a designed feature, reflecting the original game's general comfort with allowing players to find their own paths through spaces. The approach to the final battle with Erica was the same regardless of which entrance had been used, but the route taken to reach her could vary, which was a small but genuine expression of player freedom within a largely linear structure. Koga ran the poison-type gym in Fuchsia City with an almost theatrical severity, his ninja aesthetic and fondness for status conditions giving his team a quality that was more about attrition than raw power. The gym itself was filled with invisible walls that players could only discover by walking into them, creating a maze of transparent obstacles that had to be navigated through careful movement and occasional frustration. It was a design that matched its leader's philosophy, a test of patience rather than strength, rewarding players who moved methodically over those who approached directly. Blaine's gym on Cinnabar Island distinguished itself through the quiz format already mentioned, but it also stood out for the creatures he used. Arcanine was perhaps the most visually compelling of his team, described in Pokédex entries as a legendary Pokémon despite not being categorized with the legendary birds or Mewtwo. Its large, flowing mane and the flame-patterned markings on its orange fur gave it a presence that exceeded what its base stats alone communicated. The disconnect between its in-game classification as an ordinary Pokémon and the Pokédex's insistence on its legendary quality was one of those small inconsistencies the original games never resolved, leaving Arcanine to occupy a space between ordinary and exceptional that felt appropriate to something designed to look like the living idea of nobility. The fire type, in general, occupied a particular place in the Kanto roster. Fewer fire-type Pokémon were available in the region than almost any other type, making those that existed more individually significant. Players who did not choose Charmander at the start could obtain a Vulpix or Growlithe on certain routes, depending on their version, and a Magmar in the lower floors of Pokémon Mansion on Cinnabar. But the type's scarcity meant that fire specialists were likely to appear in teams alongside Pokémon of other types, which gave the fire creatures within those teams a particular visibility. They stood out because they were rare enough to be noticed. The design of fire-type Pokémon in Kanto emphasized different qualities across different creatures. Charmander and its evolutions drew from dragon mythology and reptilian biology. Ponyta and Rapidash drew from horse mythology, the flames around their manes connecting them to creatures of fire associated with speed and grace in various world traditions. Magmar looked industrial, its flame-patterned body and the flickering fire at its tail suggesting something that burned continuously as a matter of metabolic fact rather than display. Each one communicated warmth through a different lens, and together they composed a small portrait of what fire meant as a design concept in the original creative vision. The victory over the Elite Four and Blue did not end the game in any conventional sense. After the credits rolled and the Hall of Fame sequence completed, the player returned to Pallet Town, to the quiet beginning of the journey. The world remained open, the routes still traversable, the remaining Pokémon still catchable. For players who had not yet completed the Pokédex, the work of filling its remaining entries continued. For those drawn to the optional dungeon of Cerulean Cave, Mewtwo still waited. The game communicated no urgency after its climax, simply allowing the player to continue existing within the world it had built. This open-ended post-game structure became another template that subsequent Pokémon games would develop and expand. Later generations introduced additional story content after the Elite Four, new regions to explore, or secondary legendary encounters that provided continued narrative and challenge. But the original Kanto simply offered the world itself, which was its own sufficient continuation. The routes that had been traveled many times over the course of the journey held slightly different qualities after the ending, their familiarity now accompanied by a sense of completion that changed how they felt without changing what they contained. The Pokédex completion goal, reaching 151 entries, was never required by the game's main progression. Oak presented it as an aspiration at the start of the journey, noting that it was his dream to have a complete record of all existing Pokémon. But no mechanic blocked players who ignored it, and many players finished the Elite Four without having seen more than half the regional roster. Those who pursued completion did so for their own reasons, which often amounted to the same impulse that had driven Tajiri to collect insects as a child, the particular satisfaction of a category made whole. The regional birds of Kanto, Pidgey, and Spearow occupied opposite temperamental spaces, despite both being early flying types available on similar routes. Pidgey was mild, described in Pokédex entries as a common sight in fields and forests, a creature that preferred to flee from conflict rather than engage it. Spearow was fierce, territorial, and quick to attack anything it perceived as a threat. Their different temperaments were expressed not just in Pokédex text, but in the first moments of the game, when a Spearow and a group of its kind attacked the player's early Pikachu in the anime's opening episode, drawing a contrast between the aggressive common bird and the creature traveling alongside the protagonist. Pidgeot, the final evolution of Pidgey, was described as capable of flying at twice the speed of sound and carrying a trainer on its back. The scale implied by that description was considerably larger than the creature's in-game sprite suggested, a feature of many Pokédex entries that described physical capabilities beyond what the game's visual representation could communicate. This gap between text and image became a recurring characteristic of the series, allowing written descriptions to expand the sense of a creature's power and importance beyond what pixels alone could show. The flying type in the original generation was technically a secondary type for most creatures, paired with normal for early birds or more exotic base types for larger flyers. There were no pure flying type Pokémon in the original Kanto roster, meaning that every creature carrying the type also carried the characteristics of another element. This structural quirk created combinations that felt organic, reflecting the way real birds' flight existed alongside their other biological characteristics, rather than defining them completely. Normal-type Pokémon made up a substantial portion of the original roster, and their diversity within that single type framework was itself a kind of argument for the category's breadth. Snorlax, found sleeping across 2 roots in Kanto and only wakeable by the Pokeflute obtained from the top of Pokemon Tower, was a normal type. Its enormous size and the specific mechanic required to encounter it gave it an immediacy that most root encounters did not have. The Pokeflute was not just a key item, it was a moment, a specific decision to play the melody that would rouse a sleeping giant in the middle of a road, after which the encounter would begin regardless of readiness. Snorlax's design has been discussed often in the context of what makes a Pokemon immediately comprehensible. The creature communicates contentment and mass without elaborate detail. Its eyes are small and usually closed. Its expression is placid. Its proportions suggest an organism that has resolved all of life's pressures through the simple strategy of being very heavy and needing a great deal of food. There is no aggression in its design, no visual suggestion of threat, and yet its presence as a roadblock was literally obstructive. It occupied space in a way that made it genuinely consequential. To find one sleeping across a road and know that a particular melody was the only thing that would move, it was a piece of world building communicated through a mechanic rather than text. Kangaskhan, already mentioned in the context of the Safari Zone, was another normal type whose design contained implied depth. The mother-child relationship in its appearance was unusual for the original roster, in which most designs depicted single organisms rather than pairs or groups. The unseen developmental question of what a baby Kangaskhan eventually became was a thread the franchise returned to in later generations, with a mega evolution that allowed the young one to emerge and fight alongside the parent, giving canonical form to something that had been implied for many years. Farfetch'd occupied its own unusual place within the Kanto ecosystem. The creature was obtainable only through an in-game trade, given in exchange for a Spearow with a specific NPC in Vermilion City. The trade was optional, and the creature itself was widely regarded as underpowered relative to the effort required to obtain it. But its presence in the roster carried a design note that distinguished it from the simple utility of its flying companions. Farfetch'd held a leek in its wing, a stalk of wild onion that served as both weapon and comfort. Pokédex entries noted that it could not live without the leek, which it protected fiercely, and that this dependence had made it historically hunted as a source of both food and a ready-made ingredient for a popular dish. The implication that a Pokémon had been eaten by humans was unusual within the franchise's general tone, and the entry's matter-of-fact presentation of this history gave it a particular texture among the other Pokédex pages. The design of Farfetch'd itself, an ordinary-looking brown duck with a determined expression and a vegetable, was notable for how deliberately unremarkable it appeared alongside the region's more fantastical creatures. It did not glow, did not carry elemental energy visually, did not derive from mythology or ancient predator. It was simply a duck with something to protect, and the specificity of what that something was made it memorable in a way that a more obviously dramatic design might not have achieved. Ditto held a position in the Kanto roster, unlike any other creature. Its ability to transform into any Pokemon it faced, adopting the opponent's form, types, and moves while retaining its own health points, made it unique in both design and mechanical function. Its natural appearance was a small, round, lavender blob with dots for eyes and a slight curve that served as a mouth, as minimal a design as could be imagined. This minimalism was appropriate for a creature whose defining quality was its ability to become anything else. A more elaborate design would have worked against the concept, drawing attention to a form that the creature spent as little time in as possible. Ditto was found in the Pokemon Mansion on Cinnabar and on specific routes in the later part of the game, including the grass surrounding Cerulean Cave. It was also one of the only Pokemon in the breeding system introduced in later generations that could breed with any species, serving as a universal partner regardless of gender or form. This utility made it a creature that competitive players sought out carefully, examining its hidden statistics for the best possible values, an irony in a creature whose appeal rested on having no fixed characteristics of its own. The connection between Ditto and Mew has been a persistent subject of fan discussion. Both are pink, both have similarly minimal designs, and Ditto's ability to transform echoes Mew's canonical ability to use any move. The suggestion that Ditto might be a failed experiment in replicating Mew, an imperfect copy that retained only the transformation ability while losing the original's power, is not confirmed by official sources, but is coherent enough with available evidence that it has remained a meaningful thread in the community's engagement with the region's mysteries. The water routes connecting Fuchsia City to Cinnabar Island and the eastern coast passed over stretches of ocean populated by water-type Pokemon available only to those with the Surf ability. Tentacool appeared at high frequency on almost every water route, becoming for many players a source of mild frustration given how frequently it encounters interrupted movement across the ocean. But Tentacruel, its evolution, carried a design that communicated something genuinely unsettling about the depths of the ocean, its many tentacles and red-tipped head suggesting an organism that had resolved its relationship with the world through mechanisms very different from the warm-blooded creatures of the land. Lapras was found in a single location, the back of the Sylph Company building, given by an NPC who mentioned that Team Rocket had been after it. The creature was large, gentle-looking, and designed with a visual vocabulary that recalled plesiosaurs and sea serpent myths of various traditions. Its Pokédex entries described a creature that had nearly been hunted to extinction by those who valued its transportation utility, a detail that sat quietly within the game's generally optimistic tone about the relationship between humans and Pokémon. Finding and raising Lapras, knowing something of what the species had experienced, gave it an emotional quality that more commonly found creatures rarely achieved. Gyarados demonstrated perhaps the most dramatic of all Kanto evolution arcs. Magikarp, obtainable very early in the game for a price from a merchant near Mount Moon, was a small, pale fish whose only natural move was Splash, which did nothing. It could learn Tackle eventually, but its statistics were so low that even that ordinary attack rarely produced meaningful results. Raising a Magikarp from a low level to level 20 required considerable patience and usually involved allowing it to sit in the party while other Pokemon did the actual battling, earning experience passively. The reward for that patience was an evolution into Gyarados, a creature of enormous size and dragon-like fury, whose design communicated raw force and the release of something long contained. The Kanto Safari Zone's layout extended across 4 connected areas, each with different Pokemon and a small number of items findable on the ground. The gold teeth item in the zone could be traded to the warden of the zone who had lost them, and he would provide the strength ability in return, allowing the player to push boulders throughout the game's dungeons. The exchange was low-key, a side transaction that opened significant traversal options, and discovering both the teeth and the warden who wanted them was the kind of environmental puzzle that rewarded players who talked to every NPC rather than rushing through dialogue. The Pokemon available deep within the Safari Zone, beyond the areas accessible from the front gate, required the use of Surf and other travel abilities to reach. Scyther's location in one of those deeper sections meant that players who wanted it needed to have already progressed significantly through the game before attempting to catch it, which aligned the creature's availability with the phase of the journey where it would be most useful. The design choice of gating certain Pokémon behind ability requirements that were acquired through progression meant that the Safari Zone aged with the player's advancement, offering different rewards at different stages. The connection between Kanto's geography and the game's narrative pacing was one of the region's most quietly effective design choices. The player's journey moved in a rough arc around the map, beginning in the south near Pallet Town and moving through Viridian Forest, through the central cities, up to the northeastern routes near Lavender, across to Celadon and Fuchsia in the west, south to Cinnabar, and finally back north and east toward the Pokémon League. The shape of this journey meant that the player visited most of the region before reaching the ending, creating a sense of having actually traversed a place rather than simply moving through a sequence of challenges. The map's design also hid some of its connections until the player had acquired the right tools. The underground path between Celadon and Lavender appeared on the map as nothing until the player stepped into it, and the cave systems of Cerulean Cave were not visible from the surface. These hidden connections gave the region a quality of depth that a more open presentation might have dissipated, creating the consistent sense that there was always more beneath the surface of what was immediately visible. Kanto felt like a region that had been lived in before the player arrived, that had accumulated history and secrets that would not be fully revealed in a single playthrough. Revisiting the region, in later games, through the Gold and Silver versions that allowed travel from Johto into Kanto after completing that game's main story, added another dimension to the original geography. Kanto in those revisits felt changed by time, its gym leaders replaced by different challenges, several of the original leaders moved to different locations, and the general sense of a world that had continued existing after the player's first visit. The changes were not large, but they were enough to suggest the passage of time, and encountering familiar locations in a slightly altered state created a particular kind of recognition, the feeling of returning to a known place and finding it both the same and different. Pallet Town, the origin point of every Kanto journey, was one of the smallest named locations in the region, containing only the player's home, the rival's home, Professor Oak's laboratory, and a handful of NPCs with brief dialogue. Its simplicity was appropriate for a beginning, a place small enough that leaving it felt natural rather than difficult. The town's name, in the original Japanese and carried forward into international releases, referred to the color palette, the set of colors an artist uses to create a painting. The region's towns were all named after colors in Japanese, a naming convention that gave the world a particular kind of coherence without demanding that players understand it to appreciate what they were playing. Professor Oak's laboratory contained the game's most famous dialogue exchange, the moment when Oak asked the player's name and then, moments later, asked for the name of the rival. The rival, canonically Oak's grandson, received a default name in some releases, but was always nameable by the player, and the combination of the two naming sequences created an early moment of personal investment in the journey. The rival's name, whatever it was, would appear throughout the game, on gym trainer records, in Oak's dialogue, and in the champion's reveal, connecting every instance of his name to the player's original choice, and creating a thread of continuity across dozens of hours of play. The first step out of Pallet Town has been taken countless times by players of almost every age and background across decades of continued availability through remakes and virtual console releases. The path north into the tall grass, the appearance of Professor Oak before the player could reach the tall grass alone, the walk back to the lab, and the starter choice that followed, these moments have become part of the cultural vocabulary of a generation, and in some cases multiple generations, of players who encountered the world at different times and through different versions, but who all began at the same small town, under the same quiet sky, before the same great landscape of possibility opened ahead. The items scattered across Kanto's routes and dungeons created a secondary layer of engagement beneath the primary loop of catching and battling. Hidden items, discoverable only by pressing the action button at specific unmarked tiles, rewarded thorough exploration with supplies that could be used or sold. The hidden item system was one of the game's more obscure features, known through discussion between players rather than through any in-game indication that such items existed. Players who knew about it could find rare items in unexpected places. Those who did not might finish the game without discovering the system at all, which was consistent with the game's general philosophy of allowing different players to discover different depths. The Item Finder key item, available after defeating Vermilion City's gym, allowed players to detect hidden items in their vicinity. It did not mark them precisely, indicating only that something was nearby and allowing players to triangulate through repeated use. Using it in areas known to contain hidden items became its own small puzzle, a focused search within the larger exploration. The tool acknowledged the existence of the hidden item layer explicitly while still requiring player effort to extract value from it, a balance between revealing and concealing that reflected the region's broader approach to its own secrets. Technical machines and hidden machines were the mechanism by which Pokémon learned moves outside of leveling up. Technical machines were single-use in the original games, each one consumed upon teaching the move it contained to a Pokémon, which meant that decisions about which Pokémon to teach a particular TM carried a genuine consequences. Using a TM to give a certain move to one Pokémon meant no other Pokémon on the team could have it, encouraging players to think about move distribution as a design problem with real stakes. The hidden machine moves, which could be taught multiple times, and also provided field utility functions like Surf and Cut, operated under different constraints, and the moves they contained could not be forgotten at the move deleter found in later games, creating a category of permanent learnable moves that reflected their importance to the game's traversal systems. The Elite Four's individual specialties created 4 distinct challenge arcs that players navigated in sequence without breaks for healing between. The restriction on returning to a Pokémon Center during the gauntlet was not stated explicitly, but was enforced by the building's layout, which moved the player forward through each chamber without an exit path until the champion had been defeated. A team wiped out mid-gauntlet returned to the last Pokémon Center used, which for most players was the one at the base of Victory Road, requiring the cave to be traversed again before re-entering the League building. This structure created a particular kind of pressure that built across the 4 battles as the players' resources declined and the demands of each successive opponent intensified. Items could be used throughout, but a team that had expended significant health and PPs in reaching Lance's chamber might find his dragon types genuinely difficult to overcome. The legendary Dragon-type Dragonite that led his team had no direct-type counter available to most players through ordinary progression, since ice moves effective against it were limited and the creatures that learned them reliably were not easy to obtain and train before the first League challenge. Blue's team, as champion, reflected a philosophy of completeness rather than specialization. He used Pokémon of multiple types, including the evolved form of whichever starter he had received based on the player's own choice at the beginning of the game. This detail was significant because it meant the battle against Blue always involved a direct confrontation between the player's starter and its counterpart, and since Blue's starter type was chosen to be strong against the players, the final battle carried within it a structural echo of the original choice, a reminder of where the journey had begun and what had changed in the time since. The legacy of the Kanto region extends beyond its original games into the cultural space the franchise has occupied since those first years. Pokémon Red and Blue were among the first games to be discussed at length in internet forums and early web communities. Their secrets and strategies shared across spaces that were then new to most participants. The missing note phenomenon, a glitch encounter that produced a visual artifact in the player's Pokemon storage and allowed for item duplication under certain conditions, spread through early internet spaces with the speed of something that felt almost too interesting to be true. It was one of the first gaming experiences to have its community life primarily online rather than in physical spaces, a feature of timing that gave it a particular historical significance. The remakes, Pokemon Fire Red and Leaf Green, released in 2004 for the Game Boy Advance, revisited the original region with updated graphics, revised mechanics, and small additions that acknowledged the larger franchise while preserving the essential structure of the original experience. The Sevii Islands, accessible after certain story milestones, expanded the geographic scope of the Kanto adventure while remaining optional, allowing players who wanted only the original experience to mostly ignore them while providing additional content for those who wanted more. The remakes introduced a generation of players to Kanto who had not been alive or old enough to play the original games, creating the first significant wave of Kanto nostalgia experienced secondhand. Heart Gold and Soul Silver, released in 2009, included the Kanto post-game sequence from the original Gold and Silver games, restoring the experience of visiting the region after completing the Johto story. The gym leaders of Kanto in those games could be battled again with significantly stronger teams, a feature that gave players who had finished Johto a set of new challenges while also providing a reason to return to familiar spaces. The restored Red encounter at the peak of Mount Silver, in which a player character from the original games appeared as the game's most powerful and uncommunicative opponent, became one of the most discussed moments in the franchise's history, a piece of self-referential storytelling that used silence and context to say more than explicit narrative could have managed. Kanto exists now in a layered way. There is the Kanto of the original games, experienced through aging cartridges and virtual console releases with its rough sprites and particular sound chip. There is the Kanto of the anime's first season, bright and emotionally vivid, tied to specific episodes and the voices of characters who have remained unchanged across decades of continuation. There is the Kanto of the remakes, cleaner and expanded, with additional content that the original did not contain. There is the Kanto of Heart Gold and Soul Silver's postgame, a place revisited and found different. There is the Kanto of Let's Go Pikachu and Let's Go Eevee, redesigned for different hardware with a catching mechanic borrowed from Pokemon Go and a visual aesthetic that moves significantly closer to the anime's presentation. Each of these is genuinely Kanto, and each player's relationship with the region is shaped by which version they first encountered and which they have returned to since. The 151 Pokemon that populated the original region have been joined by hundreds more across subsequent generations, but they retain a particular cultural status within the franchise. Surveys of fan favorites consistently include a disproportionate number of Kanto Pokémon, not because the original designs are necessarily superior to those that followed, but because they were first, and because being first means having been present during the formation of something, having shaped the expectations against which everything subsequent has been measured. The question of what made Kanto's creature designs work is one that game designers and fans have returned to many times. The original designs were created without the benefit of hindsight, without knowing which qualities would resonate across decades of cultural use. They were created by a small team, largely by a single artist, under constraints of both time and technology, and the fact that so many of them remain immediately recognizable and emotionally relevant to millions of people represents a kind of quiet design success that is difficult to analyze fully. some qualities are apparent. The designs prioritized clear silhouettes over intricate detail, which meant they read well at small sizes and across a variety of display technologies. They drew from recognizable biological and cultural sources without copying them so literally that they felt derivative. They communicated personality through small details rather than elaborate decoration, which allowed players to project additional character onto them through their own experience of raising and using each creature. And they existed in a world that treated them as genuinely alive rather than as tools, which encouraged players to form relationships with them rather than simply viewing them as strategic resources. These qualities were not inevitable. They emerged from specific choices made by specific people under specific conditions, and the creatures that resulted were shaped as much by what was not done as by what was. The creatures that were simplified became clearer. The details that were removed allowed what remained to be seen more fully, and the world that was built around them, the roots and cities and caves and gyms of Kanto, gave them a context that made their existence feel necessary, as though the region could not have been what it was without each of them present within it. Every Pokémon in the original 151 exists within a network of relationships, both within the game and within the cultural conversation that has surrounded the franchise since its beginning. Charizard is inseparable from the arc of the trainer who raises it through three forms, from Charmander's nervous energy to Charmeleon's defiance to the winged power of its final form. Gengar carries the weight of Lavender Town and the lore about shadows. Lapras carries the quiet record of what the game said about hunting. Magikarp and Gyarados carry the story of patience and transformation. These relationships were not all planned in advance, but they accumulated through play and discussion, through episodes of the anime and moments within the games, through the conversations players had with each other about what they had experienced. The region that held all of these creatures, that gave them their context and their ecological frame, was built from the memories of a person who had spent childhood afternoons looking for insects in disappearing fields. Kanto was always, in some fundamental sense, an act of preservation, a way of holding on to the feeling of discovery within a world that was changing. The tall grass that held the first random encounter, the roots that led from one small world to the next, the caves and towers and gyms and ocean paths, all of it was shaped by a childhood impulse to go out and find something alive and bring it back and look at it carefully. That impulse translated into a game, and then into a region, and then into a franchise, and then into a cultural moment that has now lasted across multiple decades, is still present in the original 151. They are creatures from a specific time and a specific imagination, and the fact that they have traveled so far from their origins while remaining recognizable is perhaps the quietest and most interesting fact about them of all. The water that surrounded Cinnabar Island was not simply an obstacle between locations. It was itself a kind of ecosystem populated by creatures that existed nowhere else in quite the same density and variety. Tentacool and Tentacruel moved through those ocean tiles with a regularity that players who had surfed the southern coast could predict with near certainty. But Horsea appeared there too, a small blue seahorse-shaped creature whose smokescreen move allowed it to obscure opponents' accuracy, a defensive strategy built not from size or strength, but from obscuring the conditions under which an opponent could act effectively. Seadra, its evolution, added length and sharper spines to the design, while retaining the seahorse's fundamental structure, the transition between forms, suggesting growth without abandonment of origin. Shelter was found in the waters east of Cinnabar as well, its half-open shell and protruding tongue giving it a design that communicated something between playful and strange. The creature's Pokédex entries noted that its tongue caught prey by freezing it with cold air, a detail that contrasted with its fairly ordinary shell appearance and suggested hidden biological capability beneath a modest exterior. Shelter was also essential to the evolution of one of Kanto's most imposing designs. When a water stone was applied to a slowpoke, Shelter would clamp onto the end of its tail, and the combination would transform into Slowbro, a large bipedal creature with a perpetually distracted expression and a Shelter permanently fixed to one limb. The two organisms in that design existed in a relationship that defied clean categorization, each dependent on the other in ways that neither Pokédex text fully explained. Slowpoke itself occupied a comfortable position in many players' experience of the region, its extremely low speed and blank-eyed expression communicating a temperament entirely at peace with the world's pace. Its ability to feel pain slowly, a detail noted in Pokédex entries with what reads as gentle concern, was one of the more unusual biological facts in the original game. A creature that moved through life insulated from immediate sensation by a neurological quality that read as both disadvantage and a kind of accidental serenity. The electric routes to the east of Kanto, particularly the area around the power plant near Cerulean City, held a cluster of electric-type Pokémon that communicated different aspects of what electricity meant as a design concept. Voltorb was perhaps the most minimal design in the original roster, a sphere divided by color between red and white, with two eyes and an expression of mild irritation. The creature looked exactly like a Pokeball, and this resemblance was embedded in its Pokédex lore, which noted that it had been found in areas where Pokeballs were manufactured and that its origins remained unclear. Whether it evolved from a Pokeball given too much stored energy, or whether it was a Pokemon that had independently arrived at a Pokeball's appearance, was not definitively stated. Electrode was Voltorb's evolution, larger and with a reversed color scheme. Its defining characteristic was a tendency to explode, a habit described across Pokédex entries, with the observation that explosions brought Electrode something resembling pleasure. The move Explosion, available to both Voltorb and Electrode, was one of the highest base power moves in the game, delivering enormous damage at the cost of the user fainting immediately. In competitive settings, this trade-off was sometimes intentional, a sacrifice play that could decisively change the shape of a battle in the user's favor. The creature that introduced that mechanic most memorably was built around the concept of a thing that existed in order to release itself, which was a design idea as strange and as effective as it sounds. Magnemite and Magneton occupied the power plant alongside the Voltorb line, their designs representing a different approach to electric identity. Where Voltorb was organic in its simplicity, Magnemite looked assembled, a sphere with horseshoe magnets and screws attached in specific positions that gave it a mechanical rather than biological quality. Magneton took 3 Magnemite and presented them floating in close formation, their combined form described in entries as generating a magnetic field strong enough to interfere with electronic equipment and cause the erratic behavior of compasses and certain medical devices. The practical consequences of encountering Magneton, described in text that read as factual warning rather than fantasy, gave it a presence that its relatively simple visual design did not immediately suggest. Hitmonlee and Hitmonchan were the 2 Pokémon available from a single gift encounter in Saffron City's Fighting Dojo, a location that served as a precursor to the gym and whose most accomplished trainers had recently been defeated by Sabrina's psychic team. The fighting type in Kanto was represented by a small number of designs, each with a distinct martial arts association. Machop, Machoke, and Machamp formed an evolution line that was purely physical, their musculature increasing across each form in a way that was direct and unsentimental. Machamp's 4 arms gave it an immediate visual identity, a creature that had arrived at the logical conclusion of the fighting type concept by simply having more arms with which to strike. Hitmonlee and Hitmonchan were given names in international releases that referenced famous martial artists and boxers, an in-joke embedded at the design level. Hitmonlee's elongated kicking legs and stretchable body referenced kicking art forms, its feet capable of extending far beyond its natural height to reach opponents. Hitmonchan's boxing stance and the small spikes on its fists referenced striking disciplines associated with Western boxing, and its Pokédex entries mentioned that it could throw punches at speeds so high they were invisible. The two designs occupied the same conceptual space through different physical emphases, and the choice between them in Saffron City was one of those small decisions that players often remembered specifically, recalled years later, as the moment they were asked to decide between two things they could not both have. The legendary birds' shared naming structure, Articuno, Zapdos, and Moltres, embedded the numbers 1, 2, and 3 in each name through modified number words from different languages. Articuno carried uno, meaning one in Spanish and Italian. Zapdos carried dos, meaning two. Moltres carried tres, meaning three. The pattern was visible once noticed, giving the three creatures a structural relationship that their visual designs also supported through their shared silhouette type, large bipedal birds with long tails, each colored in the palette of its element. The design coherence between them communicated that they were a set before any external information confirmed it. The legendary birds did not interact within the narrative of the original games. They existed in their separate locations, available to those who found them, without any in-game story connecting their presences or explaining their distribution across the region. The anime provided that context through an extended theatrical film in which all three birds came into conflict at a specific island where their elemental competition attracted the attention of a fourth being whose presence alone was capable of calming the disruption. The film was the first theatrical Pokémon production and arrived at a moment when the franchise's cultural reach was at its first peak, reaching audiences who had never played the games alongside those who had spent hundreds of hours within them. The rock-type Pokémon of Kanto's mountain roots carried a quality of permanence that contrasted with the more active and mobile creatures of forests and oceans. Geodude, Graveler, and Golem composed an evolution line that was literally made of stone, their forms at each stage more rounded and boulder-like than the one before. Golem was obtained through trade, like Gengar, which meant that players who wanted the final form needed either a friend with a second game or access to a trade event. Its design in that final form was a sphere of rock with short, strong limbs, an organism that had resolved the question of survival by becoming as completely as biology allowed, indistinguishable from the geological environment it inhabited. Onix was one of the tallest Pokémon in the original roster, a long chain of large boulders forming a serpentine body that moved through rock and earth with the ease of a creature whose structure made most solid matter navigable. Brock's Onix in the first gym was many players' first encounter with a creature that felt genuinely large, its sprite taking up more of the screen than any previous encounter had, its cry low and grinding. The battle against it with a low-level starter was designed to be difficult, intended to communicate that the world beyond Pallet Town contained things more powerful than what the beginning of the journey had prepared the player for. The lesson was not that winning was impossible, but that overcoming significant challenges required more than what was immediately at hand. Raiden, the final evolution of Rhyhorn, was described in Pokédex entries as capable of running through solid concrete and surviving a volcanic eruption without discomfort. Its drill-shaped horn was designed to destroy rock and iron, and its hard skin deflected even bullets without marking. The hyperbolic capacity described in these entries for rock and ground-type Pokémon had a consistent theme: invulnerability to the ordinary forces that shaped the non-Pokémon world. Creatures made of stone, or capable of moving through it, existed in a relationship with their environment that was defined by imperviousness rather than adaptation, and that quality gave the rock and ground type a particular sense of geological permanence within the roster. Drowsy and Hypno were the psychic type line found on certain routes before Saffron City, their designs drawing from the tapir and from figures of hypnotic suggestion common in popular media representations of stage hypnotism. Drowsy's Pokédex entries noted that it fed on dreams, approaching sleeping people and animals to consume the dream content while they slept, preferring the sweeter dreams of children. The calm, slightly troubling quality of that description was consistent with the psychic type's general position in the original games as a force that operated within the mind rather than on the body, making its power harder to quantify and its encounters subtly more unsettling than those with physical type opponents. Hypno carried a pendulum as a defining visual element, its swinging motion central to the creature's appearance and its association with hypnotic suggestion. The design was direct in the way that many original Kanto designs were direct, placing the thematic element prominently rather than concealing it within the creature's biology. Players who encountered Hypno in the wild found it in the later routes of the game, where the overall difficulty of wild encounters had increased enough that its use of hypnosis moves could genuinely threaten a team that was not prepared for status conditions. The move Hypnosis, which put an opponent to sleep, was one of the most reliable ways to enable capture of high-level wild Pokémon, which gave Drowsy and Hypno a utility in catching other creatures that partially explained their presence in a player's team even when more powerful psychic alternatives were available. Clefairy and Clefable, the creatures that might have been the franchise's mascot, were found in a specific location in the original games that gave them a particular quality distinct from other normal types. Mountby's Moon, the first cave of the game, held both Zubat and Paris and Geodude as common encounters, but Clefairy appeared there as a rare encounter tied to a moonstone geological feature deep within the cave. Their scarcity in that location, combined with the moonstones found there that could evolve them into Clefable immediately, created a small narrative loop. Find the rare creature in the Cave of Moonstones, and have immediately at hand the mechanism for its transformation. Clefable was one of the fastest evolving creatures in the game, in the sense that no leveling was required, only the application of a stone. But that evolution also foreclosed the possibility of learning certain moves only accessible to Clefairy, which meant players who wanted specific capabilities in a Clefairy line Pokémon had to choose between evolution and move access, a small but genuine strategic decision embedded in what otherwise seemed like a simple use item get evolution progression. The Moonstone evolution mechanic applied to several Pokémon in the original roster, including Nidorina and Nidoqueen's branch, Jigglypuff into Wigglytuff, Clefairy into Clefable, and Skarmory not being available in this generation. The Moonstone itself was a somewhat rare item, findable in Mount, Moon, and in a few other locations, which meant that players had to choose which eligible Pokémon to evolve first if they had multiple candidates and a limited supply. The item's connection to the Moon gave that evolution line tied to it a cohesive thematic identity, even if that connection was never explicitly developed in the original games' narrative. Jigglypuff occupied a position in the original games that its later role in the anime and in the Super Smash Bros. Franchise has considerably amplified in retrospect. Within the Kanto games themselves, It was a normal and fairy type creature, though the fairy type designation did not exist in the original generation, where it was simply normal. Its design, a round pink shape with large blue eyes and a curl of hair on top of its head, was the visual extreme of the softness that characterized many Kanto normal types. Its signature move, Sing, put opponents to sleep with an accuracy rate low enough that missing it was a reliable risk, and its tendency to draw on the microphone in the anime, writing angry messages on the faces of audiences who fell asleep to its song, created a personality larger than its in-game mechanical presentation. Wigglytuff, Jigglypuff's evolution via Moonstone, was larger and firmer in appearance, its inflated quality suggesting something between plush and pneumatic. Its Pokédex entries noted that its soft fur was so comfortable to touch that those who encountered it could not stop touching it, an observation that sat quietly within what was otherwise a game focused on battles and routes. The small slice of sensory detail in those entries was part of what gave the Pokédex as a document its particular texture, alternating between practical capability descriptions and observations about what a creature's presence was like to experience in ordinary life. The Game Boy's technical characteristics shaped the experience of Kanto in ways that went beyond sprite resolution and sound chip limitations. The original games saved data to a battery inside the cartridge, and the battery had a lifespan of approximately 10 years under typical conditions. Players who returned to their original red or blue cartridges after many years sometimes found that their saved data had vanished, all their hours of work and all their caught Pokémon gone without explanation. The discovery of a dead battery and the understanding of what it meant for preserved game data was a particular kind of loss that connected the physical life of an object to the preservation of a digital experience in a way that later save methods, cloud-based or flash-based, no longer required players to consider. The experience of playing a game on hardware that could literally die and take one's progress with it connected ownership of the cartridge to a kind of temporal relationship that the content within it did not otherwise suggest. A Kanto save file was always provisional, in a way that digital downloads and online saves are not, dependent on a battery-keeping charge in a small piece of physical media that aged alongside the person who had originally played it. The players who had kept their original cartridges and returned to find them intact had something that genuinely could not be reproduced once it was gone, not just the saved data, but the continuity between their past self and the game they had played. The link cable communication between Game Boys during trades and battles was similarly physical in its requirements. The cable had to be connected. Both systems had to be powered. The data transfer happened slowly enough that both players had to remain relatively still during the process. These physical requirements meant that certain mechanics, particularly trade evolutions, required not just another person, but another person physically present. The social dimension of trading was not abstract, but embodied, requiring proximity and patience, and the kind of trust implied by handing someone your game cartridge and expecting them to trade back. The sound design of the original Kanto games communicated emotional registers that the limited instrumentation would seem to preclude. The Pokémon Center theme, a gentle ascending melody that played over the healing animation, acquired an association with relief and restoration that went beyond its objective musical qualities, becoming the audio equivalent of a safe arrival after difficulty. Players who heard that melody after a difficult route or a close battle experienced something like actual relief, the sound connecting to the game state in a way that made the music feel functional rather than merely decorative. The battle themes carried their own emotional vocabulary. The wild battle theme was urgent and aggressive without being threatening, communicating the energy of an unexpected encounter that needed to be resolved but was not itself dangerous. The trainer battle theme added intensity without quite reaching the level of the gym leader theme, which escalated further to communicate the sense that this particular battle mattered more than those preceding it. The Elite Four theme and the Champion theme represented the top of that escalation, compositions that played during the most consequential battles of the journey and that most players heard only after many hours of the preceding music had established the contrast. The music of Lavender Town, already discussed in terms of its atmospheric effect, was distinguished from other location themes by its use of frequencies that other compositions in the game avoided. The resulting unease was achieved through specific choices about what sounds to include and at what pitch, and the effect it produced was consistent enough that it became part of the location's identity in ways that the visual design alone could not have achieved. Sound carried emotional information in the original Kanto games with an efficiency that the technology's limitations paradoxically enabled, the constraints forcing the composers toward solutions that worked precisely because they operated within the bounds of what the hardware could produce. The Pokémon trade that happened within Kanto as an in-game transaction, as opposed to the link cable trades between players, offered specific Pokémon unavailable through ordinary catching, in exchange for common creatures that the player already had. The far-fetched trade in Vermilion required a Spearow. A Jinx could be received in Cerulean in exchange for a Poliwag. A Machoke could be obtained in exchange for a Drowsy. Each of these in-game trades came with a quirk. The received Pokémon was considered to have originated from another trainer, which meant it accumulated experience faster than the player's own caught Pokémon up to a certain level threshold, and then more slowly above it. The mechanic encouraged players to use their traded Pokémon actively while they were at lower levels, building a relationship with creatures that arrived with someone else's name attached to them. Jinx, received in Cerulean City, was a humanoid ice and psychic type whose design drew from Gyaru fashion and blonde-haired aesthetics associated with a particular Japanese youth culture of the period. The creature became the subject of cultural criticism in later years that led to a change in its skin coloration from black to purple in international releases, a revision that altered its visual presentation while preserving its design structure. The conversation around Jinx's original design and the decision to change it became one of the more visible examples in the franchise's history of how the cultural context of design decisions could shift over time, requiring revision not because the design had failed within its original context, but because that context itself had become more widely interrogated. The caves of Kanto had personalities distinct from the roots that connected them. Mount. Moon was the first, smaller and more welcoming than what followed. Its main challenge the trainers and wild encounters within rather than any navigational puzzle. Victory Road, the cave immediately preceding the Pokémon League, was the opposite. A complex three-floor structure that required the use of strength to push boulders into specific positions, closing off certain passages and opening others before the correct exit could be reached. Players who had never consulted a guide sometimes spent considerable time within Victory Road working through the boulder puzzles by trial and error, occasionally arriving at dead ends that required retracing several steps. The experience of navigating Victory Road without guidance was one of the original game's more effective moments of earned difficulty, placing a genuine cognitive puzzle immediately before the game's greatest challenge. Players who emerged from Victory Road into the daylight before the Pokémon League building had solved something, and that sense of accomplishment carried into the first steps of the Elite Four Gauntlet in a way that directly entering the League building from a road would not have produced. The cave served as a threshold that had to be crossed before the culminating challenge could begin, and the difficulty of that threshold was calibrated to the position it held in the journey. Rock Tunnel, the cave connecting Lavender Town to Cerulean and traversable through a pitch-dark interior that required flash to navigate clearly, was a different kind of challenge. Players without flash could still navigate it by moving carefully and using their knowledge of the map, but the absence of visibility made the process genuinely disorienting. The Pokémon encountered within were at mid-game strength, and the trainers placed throughout the tunnel contributed to the resource drain that made emerging from the other side feel like a minor recovery event in itself. Zubat, the most common encounter within the cave, had a high frequency of appearance and the move Supersonic, which could cause the player's Pokémon to hurt themselves through confusion, compounding the resource pressure of the environment. The ice path that connected the later portions of the game to the Pokémon League area through the northeastern part of the region was a puzzle environment in which the player slid across ice tiles without stopping until hitting a wall or an obstacle. The puzzle required players to find the correct sequence of slides that would move them from the entrance to the exit using strategically placed boulders to redirect paths that would otherwise carry too far in a single direction. The mechanic was introduced nowhere else in Kanto, making it a local puzzle type specific to this one area of the region. Players who solved it for the first time often noted the satisfaction of the solution's logic, the way that the final correct path became obvious once the preparatory moves had been made. This moment of clarity after confusion was characteristic of puzzle design that worked, not making the solution so obvious that no discovery was required, but not making the necessary steps so obscure that they required external guidance to find. The ice puzzle in the northeastern cave sat at a difficulty level that was achievable through patient experimentation and the physical pleasure of seeing the player sprite slide smoothly from one boulder to another in the final correct path delivered a small but genuine reward for the cognitive investment. The herbs and berries available through certain NPCs and shop inventories provided the player with healing and status cure items alongside the standard potion and antidote lines. The lemonade, fresh water, and soda pop available from the Celadon department store's vending machines healed specific amounts of HP at a lower cost than equivalent items bought from Pokemarts, a minor economic optimization that rewarded players who knew about the machines. The items were functionally similar to potions, but framed differently, their names suggesting ordinary refreshing beverages being repurposed as medical treatment for Pokémon, which was a small but consistent piece of the world-building logic that governed how human and Pokémon economies intersected. The department store in Celadon was the largest commercial space in Kanto, multiple floors containing TMs, evolutionary stones, decorative items, and the vending machines. Its existence as a shopping destination within an adventure game was a design choice that reflected the region's interest in building a world that felt functional rather than purely adventurous. People in Kanto bought things, trainers purchased supplies, gym badges provided access to improved versions of items in certain shops. The economic dimension of the game was never the focus, but it was present throughout, and the Celadon department store was its most explicit expression. The endings of the original games, brief and understated, left players in a world that continued without resolution or directed conclusion. The credits that played after defeating Blue were accompanied by music that felt celebratory without being grandiose, a melody that carried the warmth of completion without suggesting that the journey itself was finished. What the credits closed was not the world, but the main narrative thread, and the distinction between those two things was part of what gave Kanto its quality of continued presence after the story's conclusion. Players who returned after the credits often found that the world felt different in a way that was not strictly about the content. The roots were the same, The NPCs repeated their dialogue. The wild Pokémon appeared with the same frequencies, but the player moving through those spaces carried the weight of what had been completed, and that weight changed the quality of the familiar. Pallet Town, revisited after defeating the champion, was still small and still quiet, but it was the small, quiet place that had been the beginning, which was not the same thing as being an unremarkable, small, quiet place. This quality of resonance after completion, the way places feel different once something significant has been done within them, is one of the experiences that make returning to games worthwhile across time. The original Kanto games were designed for a single playthrough in the sense that the narrative had a direction and a conclusion, but they held within their routes and encounters enough variety and depth to reward continued exploration long after that narrative had resolved. Players who had caught every Pokémon and defeated every trainer and found every hidden item had not exhausted what the region offered. They had only completed the inventory of it. The experience of being within it, moving through spaces that carried accumulated meaning, was something that continued regardless of whether any checklist remained incomplete. Kanto stays because it was first, and because being first means having shaped the template against which everything that follows is measured. But it also stays because the quiet roads between its towns and the still water of its southern coast and the careful placement of creatures in their tall grass and ocean roots communicated something about the pleasure of moving through a world at the player's own pace, looking for something without being entirely sure what it was, and finding again and again that there was more there than any single journey could contain. The Pokémon storage system managed by Bill was not simply a convenience feature. It was a quiet revolution in how players related to the creatures they collected. Before its existence as a game concept, the idea that a trainer might catch more than 6 Pokémon would have created an immediate practical problem. Where did the others go? What happened to them between battles? And how did a trainer manage a collection that exceeded what could be carried at any one time? Bill's system resolved this through a framework that felt internally consistent with the world's logic. Pokémon existed in a digital space that could hold them in stasis, healthy and preserved, until the trainer chose to retrieve them. The fact that the system was named after its creator, and that the creator was a person the player met and helped, gave it a biographical weight that a simple storage menu would not have carried. The act of visiting a Pokémon Center's PC terminal to access Bill's storage box was one of the quieter rituals of the game. Players who had filled their party and caught something new stood at those terminals and made decisions about which of their current team to rotate out, decisions that carried real emotional complexity for players who had raised certain Pokémon over many hours and many routes. Leaving a creature in the box was not a neutral act for most players. It was a temporary separation from something that had become familiar, even if the game's mechanics gave no weight to that absence. The fact that so many players reported feeling reluctant to box certain Pokémon, even when it was the strategic choice, says something about how effectively the game had built attachment into its fundamental loop. Bill's boxes held a maximum of 20 Pokémon in the original generation, and each box had to be manually changed once it filled. Players who forgot to switch boxes before catching their next Pokémon would receive a message indicating that the current box was full, at which point captured Pokémon could not be stored, and any attempts to catch new ones would fail if the party was also at capacity. This mechanical limitation created moments of planning and awareness around storage that later games gradually reduced and eventually eliminated through automatic box expansion systems. The original constraint, minor as it was, kept players conscious of the storage system as a real space with real limits rather than an infinite abstraction. The fishing mechanics of the original Kanto games, introduced a secondary catching system that operated entirely differently from encounters in tall grass or caves. 3 rods, obtainable from different NPCs at specific points in the game, each accessed different tiers of water-type Pokémon. The old rod, received from a fisherman in Viridian City, could only produce Magikarp. The good rod, given by another fisherman in Fuchsia City, opened access to Poliwag, Goldeen, and Slowpoke on various water tiles. The super rod, available from the fishing guru's house on Route 12, revealed the full range of aquatic Pokémon available in a given location. The layering of rod quality over location created a system where the same patch of water could yield completely different encounters depending on which tool was used, which rewarded players who had sought out all 3 rods and remembered to carry them. Players who fished only with the old rod and assumed that water tiles held nothing of interest would have found Magikarp in every body of water and concluded that fishing was a minor curiosity at best. The full picture required multiple tools and the awareness that each body of water had depths beyond what the most basic approach revealed. Goldeen was one of the water Pokémon accessible through fishing, a small golden fish with a prominent horn on its forehead and a flowing tail fin that gave it the look of something between a fairground prize and a creature of genuine natural elegance. Its evolution, Seeking, was larger and more dramatically colored, the horn becoming more pronounced, and the orange and white coloring deepening into something that felt almost ceremonial. Neither was particularly powerful by the game's metrics, but Goldeen held a place in the game's culture through its appearance in the anime's opening sequence, its leaping form captured in the iconic image of Pokémon emerging from water that opened each episode. The poison type was one of the most broadly distributed in the original Kanto games, appearing as a secondary type on many normal and grass-type creatures, and as the primary type on several lines that inhabited the region's earlier routes. Akons, the small purple snake obtainable only in Pokémon Red, was one of the game's starker version exclusives, absent entirely from Blue. Its evolution Arbok was larger and more visually complex, the pattern on the inside of its hood designed to function as a deterrent display toward predators. Pokédex entries noted that the hood pattern varied by region, which was one of the small pieces of implied biological world building the original text blocks delivered without dramatizing. Grimer and Mook inhabited the industrial areas of the region, particularly the Pokémon Mansion and the power plant, their sludge-based forms suited to environments that accumulated waste and chemical residue. Mook's Pokédex entries described a creature whose very touch corrupted the ground beneath it, killing plant life and contaminating water. These entries carried an environmental subtext that was unusual for the game's general tone, noting ecological damage in matter-of-fact language, as though reporting facts about a natural phenomenon. The design of Grimer and Mooks, while not naturalistic in a biological sense, embedded a commentary about pollution and industrial waste into creatures that were themselves made of what those processes produced. Coughing and wheezing, available more broadly across the game's middle routes, were similarly industrial in their reference points, their spherical bodies filled with toxic gases that periodically vented through visible pores. Wheezing's design, 2 spheres of different sizes fused together with a smaller third emerging between them, was one of the more unusual body plans in the original roster, a creature that looked like the result of a process rather than a single organism's development. Team Rocket in the anime used both coughing and wheezing as their primary battle Pokémon, which gave the two a cultural visibility beyond what their in-game availability alone would have produced, making them associated with villainy in a way that influenced how players encountered them in the wild. The Zubat that populated every cave in Kanto became one of the franchise's most discussed creatures, not because of any particular quality in its design, but because of the frequency of its appearance. Players navigating Mount Moon, Rock Tunnel, Seafoam Islands, Victory Road, and Cerulean Cave encountered Zubat at a rate that exceeded almost any other creature in any equivalent space. And because Zubat could not see, its design rationale for using echolocation-based moves that lowered accuracy created a combination of ubiquity and mild mechanical nuisance that players found consistently memorable. The creature became shorthand for the experience of navigating caves in Pokémon games, its name functioning as a kind of ambient description of the experience rather than a specific reference to one particular encounter. Golbat, Zubat's evolution at level 22, was substantially larger and more aggressive in design. Its wide-open mouth, revealing oversized fangs, and its wingspan expanding to a scale that made the creature feel genuinely threatening in a way the small Zubat did not. But because Golbat was rare relative to Zubat in most cave environments, players who had developed a low opinion of the line based on repeated Zubat encounters often had less experience with the evolved form. The disproportion between how frequently the basic form was encountered and how rarely the evolved form appeared was itself a comment on how the ecosystem of the caves had been designed, suggesting populations in which only a small percentage of individuals reached maturity. Parasect, the evolution of Paras found in Mount Moon and later routes, represented one of the original game's more unsettling biological concepts, though it was presented with the same matter-of-fact tone the Pokédex applied to everything else. The Tochukaso mushroom that grew on Paras as a small pair of fungi had by the time of evolution into Parasect completely consumed the host organism, its mycelium controlling the creature's movement while the Parasect's original consciousness was effectively gone. The entries noted this with clinical directness, describing a creature whose actions were no longer its own. Players who absorbed this description and continued to train and battle with their Parasect were in some sense directing a creature that was no longer fully the creature they had caught, which was a piece of quiet horror embedded in ordinary game content that became more visible the more carefully the entries were read. The interaction between the Pokémon world's technology and its ecological life was one of the more interesting aspects of Kanto's implicit world building. The Pokédex itself was a device that recognized and recorded information about Pokémon, but its mechanism was never explained. Pointing the device at a creature produced information that had presumably been gathered through research, but the speed of that recognition and the depth of the data suggested a database far more comprehensive than any individual researcher could have assembled. The fact that Professor Oak distributed these devices to new trainers as standard equipment implied an infrastructure of Pokémon research and documentation that existed before the game's events and that the player's journey contributed to rather than initiated. The Pokémon Center healing machines operated on principles that the game also did not explain, restoring any number of Pokémon to full health in seconds without requiring any visible treatment or material input. The Nurse Joy characters who operated these machines across every center in the region were part of a family whose members staffed facilities across multiple regions, a detail that the anime made explicit but the games left as an unexplained visual consistency. Players who noticed that the nurses in every center looked identical were free to interpret this as either a canonical extended family whose members shared an unusual physical similarity or as a design shortcut that had become part of the franchise's visual language. HM moves like Surf and Fly operated outside the game's ordinary mechanical framework in ways that the world's logic acknowledged without fully explaining. A trainer could carry a Lapra or a Peugeot in their team and access water routes or air travel at will, but only if a gym badge of sufficient prestige was held. The badge requirement for HM use was explained as a matter of training and achievement, rather than as a physical modification to the HM's function, which meant that the same move taught to the same Pokémon would behave differently depending on what rectangular piece of metal the trainer carried. The system prioritized game design clarity over logical coherence, which was consistent with how many of the game's systems operated, and the slight implausibility of badge gating HM use rarely troubled players who encountered it, within the context of everything else the world asked them to accept. The concept of type effectiveness in the original games created a strategic layer that operated beneath the moment-to-moment decisions of catching and training. Every Pokémon carried one or two types, and every move carried a type, and the interaction between a move's type and the target's type produced damage multipliers that rewarded players who had learned the system and punished those who had not. The type chart in the original games differed from later versions in ways that had real strategic consequences. Ghost moves did not affect psychic types, despite the game's implied logic suggesting they should. Bug was nominally strong against psychic, but had few reliable moves of that type at useful power levels. Poison was strong against Bug on the original chart, a relationship later removed. These quirks gave the original competitive environment a particular character shaped by the specific imbalances of the type system. Psychic type's dominance was a result not just of its native creatures having high special attack statistics, but of the effective absence of reliable counters in ordinary play. Players who understood this could design their own teams around it, either by using psychic types offensively or by accepting that certain matchups would require workarounds rather than type-effective solutions. The constraint was itself a design space, and the players who navigated it most effectively often did so through creative applications of the moves and typings available rather than through any single dominant strategy. The special stat in the original games governed both the offensive and defensive capabilities in non-physical interactions, meaning that a high special stat made a Pokémon both more powerful with special attacks and more resistant to them. This created a second axis of advantage for creatures with high special stats. They were simultaneously better at dealing and surviving the damage that was most impactful in late-game battles. Alakazam's extremely high special stat placed it in a different category from most other Pokémon in terms of both dealing and absorbing psychic-type attacks, which contributed significantly to its competitive dominance in the original game's environment. Nidoran male and Nidoran female were notable as the only Pokémon in the original roster whose gender was embedded in their name and design as the primary distinguishing factor between two separate Pokédex entries. Most Pokémon in the original games existed without a defined gender, the concept of Pokémon gender being introduced formally in later generations. The Nidoran pair were the exception, their evolutionary lines diverging toward different final forms and carrying different statistical emphasis. Nidoking was more offensively oriented, its design angular and aggressive. Nidoqueen was more defensively proportioned, its broader silhouette and heavier build communicating resilience over speed. The poison point ability that both lines carried, causing opponents to become poisoned on contact, was consistent with the visual design of their spines and horns, an example of a creature whose appearance directly communicated its mechanical properties. Players who fought Nidoran in the early routes without knowing about this ability sometimes had their starter Pokémon poisoned unexpectedly, creating a resource management situation earlier in the game than most players anticipated. The experience taught a lesson about Pokémon appearing harmless that carried forward into later encounters, building the instinct to consider any unfamiliar wild Pokémon a potential source of surprise. The Moonstone evolution that took Nidorina to Nidoqueen and Nidorino to Nidoking meant that both final forms were obtainable without leveling past their intermediate stages, which could be useful for players who wanted specific moves from the evolved forms rather than the moveset available to the intermediate stages. Both Nidoking and Nidoqueen were notable for being able to learn a wide variety of technical machine moves, their normal type move access covering much of the available TM library. This versatility made them adaptable to different team configurations and gave players who had raised them from early roots a useful all-purpose Pokémon that could be adjusted to fill gaps in the team's coverage. The Game Boy Color version of Pokémon Yellow added a chromatic dimension to the Kanto experience that the original monochrome displays had not provided. Grass appeared green, water appeared blue. The distinctions between environments that the original games communicated through sprite shading alone became visually explicit in a way that changed how the world felt without changing what it contained. Players who had played Red or Blue on an original Game Boy and then returned to Yellow on a Game Boy Color described the experience of color as making the world feel more settled and real. The visual ambiguity of monochrome resolved into certainty. The special Pikachu edition printing of the game in several markets included a yellow-colored Game Boy unit, a packaging decision that tied the hardware color to the game's content and created an object whose appearance was inseparable from its association with the franchise. Players who owned these yellow Game Boys were carrying a visible marker of their connection to the game, and the device's color functioned as both aesthetic choice and brand communication simultaneously. The relationship between hardware color and game branding was one the franchise returned to multiple times across subsequent hardware generations, though the yellow Game Boy of the Pikachu edition remains among the most distinctly remembered of these associations. The differences in encounter rates and available Pokémon between Red and Blue were not randomly distributed. Each version received access to Pokémon that were thematically distinct from the other in specific ways. Red players had Ekans and Arbok, while Blue players had Sandshrew and Sandslash. Red players could find Oddish and its evolutions, while Blue players had Bellsprout and its evolutions. The pairings across versions often placed creatures with complementary aesthetics or ecological niches on opposite sides, ensuring that each version felt like a genuine alternative perspective on the region rather than simply a different selection from the same pool. Sandshrew and Sandslash, exclusive to Blue, presented an alternative ground-type experience to the Diglett and Dugtrio line available in both versions. Where Diglett was minimal in the extreme, Sandshrew was covered in overlapping scale-like plates that communicated both its desert origin and its defensive biology. Sandslash added claws and a more aggressive silhouette while retaining the armored quality of the basic form, and its design was one of the more clearly beloved of the original roster among players who had access to it. Its clean lines and intuitive appearance, working within the visual language established by the generation without requiring any external cultural knowledge to appreciate. Diglett and Dugtrio were among the original game's most unusual designs in terms of what they did not show. The creatures existed permanently embedded in the ground, their below-soil anatomy unknown, and the subject of long-running fan discussion that the franchise occasionally acknowledged without resolving. The question of what a Diglett looked like below the surface was genuinely unanswered by any official source for many years, and the mystery was one of those small textural details that gave the original roster a quality of incompleteness in the most interesting sense, suggesting a world that had not been fully described, where the player's knowledge of any given creature was necessarily partial. Dugtrio, 3 Diglett aligned in a row within a single frame, raised the additional question of whether it was one organism or 3, and whether the 3 heads operated with independent or unified consciousness. The Pokédex entries did not resolve this clearly, noting cooperative behavior without specifying whether that cooperation implied a single mind or multiple minds operating in synchrony. The ambiguity was consistent with how the original games handled biological questions generally, present enough detail to suggest depth, leave enough open to allow imagination to continue working beyond the text. The item economy of the original games created a relationship between progress and resource management that rewarded players who engaged with all of the game's systems rather than relying on any single approach. Players who battled every trainer on every route earned consistent income from the trainer's post-battle payment, which scaled with the level of the Pokémon the trainer used. Trainers in later routes paid significantly more than those in the early areas, which meant that a player who had challenged every trainer they encountered would arrive at the Pokémon League with more resources than one who had avoided encounters. The game never stated this connection explicitly, but it reinforced the idea that engagement with the world's challenges was materially beneficial. The Pokémart inventory in different cities reflected the player's progress in a way that created a sense of the game tracking achievement through the availability of supplies. Early Pokémarts stocked only the most basic healing items. Later shops in cities accessible after collecting multiple badges offered stronger potions and additional status-curing items. The most complete inventory was available in the Pokémon League's own shop, which stocked Ultra Balls and full restores, alongside other high-level supplies. This progression of available goods meant that the commercial infrastructure of the region grew with the player's advancement, a small piece of world building that made the economy feel responsive to the trainer's increasing capability. The TM and HM system distributed specific moves across the game in ways that created both scarcity and anticipation. Players who knew what TMs were available or could plan their teams in advance, identifying which Pokémon would benefit most from specific moves and ensuring that those Pokémon were in the party when the relevant TMs became accessible. The single-use nature of TMs in the original generation made this planning consequential in a way that later regeneration did not require, because a TM used on the wrong Pokémon could not be undone and could not be replicated without finding a second copy of the same item, which for many TMs was impossible within a single playthrough. Professor Oak's dialogue at the beginning of the game and the brief moments in which he appeared throughout the journey sketched a character whose primary function was guidance, but whose backstory was suggested in fragmentary ways. His relationship with his grandson, the player's rival, was warm but complicated. The latter's competitive aggression and dismissiveness toward the Pokédex research project, creating friction that played differently in each encounter across the game. Players who paid attention to the rival's dialogue across the journey could trace an arc of development in which the early cockiness softened gradually as the challenges increased, without the game ever explicitly acknowledging this change. The rival's name, chosen by the player at the start of the game, gave him a particular kind of presence that characters with fixed names did not carry. Whatever name the player had entered appeared in Oak's dialogue, in gym records, in the champion's reveal, in every context where the rival was referenced externally. Players who had chosen meaningful names, their own name, a friend's name, a name from another piece of media, experienced those references differently from those who had accepted default options, the personal investment in the naming creating an additional layer of connection to encounters that might otherwise have felt routine. The champion reveal was one of the game's most carefully constructed moments, precisely because it required almost no construction. Players who had paid attention knew from the rival's earlier appearances and from Oak's references that his grandson was traveling a similar path. The discovery of him in the champion's seat was surprising in the sense that the timing was unexpected, but coherent in the sense that everything preceding it had implied the possibility. The absence of any dramatic announcement or extended cutscene before the battle began was consistent with how the rest of the game handled its significant moments. Simply present them, let them speak in their own terms, and trust the player to feel their weight. The Pokemon world's approach to health and medicine was one of the more quietly interesting aspects of Kanto's implicit world building. Pokemon centers provided instantaneous healing without any visible procedure, the machines receiving whatever team was placed into them and returning them restored within seconds. The nurses who operated these machines thanked trainers for bringing their Pokemon and wished them well on their journey, a ritual of courteous exchange that treated the healing as a service rendered and a relationship maintained rather than as a transaction. The language was warm without being excessive, and the consistency of the interaction across every center in the region gave it the quality of a genuine institution rather than a gameplay convenience. The items that players used outside of centers to heal their Pokemon during battle or on routes operated on similar principles of unstated mechanism. A potion applied to a Pokemon restored a specific amount of hit points without any indicated delivery system beyond the visual of an item being used and a number changing. The game did not ask players to consider how a spray bottle of indeterminate liquid restored the biological integrity of a creature that had been struck by fire or ice or electricity. It simply allowed the restoration to happen, trusting that players would accept the premise rather than interrogate it, which was consistent with the broader contract the game made with its audience about what kinds of questions would and would not be asked. Antidotes, burn heals, Parley's heals, and awakening items address the status conditions that Pokemon could sustain through the moves of wild and trainer-owned Pokemon, and their availability from early Pokemarts ensured that the tactical problems these conditions created were rarely permanent if the player carried appropriate supplies. The full heal, which resolved any status condition, provided a single item solution that was available in later marts, simplifying inventory management for players who preferred not to carry individual cures for each possible condition. The existence of both specific and general cures was a small but characteristic example of the game offering multiple approaches to the same problem. The bicycle mechanic, obtained from the bike shop in Cerulean City through a voucher given by the Pokemon Fan Club chairman in Vermilion, provided a traversal speed increase on routes while requiring the player to first navigate a social interaction that the game wrapped around the item acquisition. The chairman, a verbose enthusiast of his own Pokemon, would speak at length about the creature if allowed to continue, and receiving the bike voucher required sitting through that enthusiasm without an option to skip. The design communicated something about the world the player was moving through. It contained people with deep personal attachments to their Pokemon, and interacting with those people sometimes required patience before useful things were received. The bicycle also could not be used inside buildings, on water, or in most dungeon environments, which meant that the traversal benefit it provided was specific to open routes where its speed increase was most beneficial. Players who had grown accustomed to moving quickly across routes sometimes felt the transition back to walking speed in caves or towns more acutely than they had felt walking speed before the bicycle was obtained, which is a psychological feature of any mechanic that provides a speed increase. The removal of the benefit feels like a loss even when returning to what was previously the norm. The bicycle's presence in the game's item inventory was constant, and the switch between walking and cycling was immediate, which meant players could calibrate their traversal method to whatever environment they were moving through. The running shoes that later generations introduced were not present in Kanto, meaning that the base walking speed was the only option in indoor and dungeon environments throughout the original games. This constraint is largely invisible to players who experienced Kanto first through Fire Red or Leaf Green, where a later game item provided running speed indoors. Players who played the original red, blue, or yellow moved at a single pace everywhere except on the bicycle, and that pace shaped the rhythm of the entire experience in ways that felt normal at the time and retrospectively carry the texture of something slower and more deliberate than subsequent games allowed. The Pokemon Fan Club in Vermilion was one of several locations in Kanto that served primarily as a social space where NPCs expressed emotional attachments to specific Pokemon. These spaces had no direct mechanical purpose beyond the items or information that could be obtained through conversation, but their existence implied a world in which the relationship between humans and Pokemon was not solely about battle and training. People collected Pokemon for the pleasure of their company. They joined clubs to discuss them with others who shared their appreciation. They gave away valuable items to trainers who were willing to listen to their enthusiasm. The design of these spaces suggested a background culture of Pokemon appreciation that the trainer protagonist was participating in without being the center of. The Name Raider, found in a house in Lavender Town, offered players the ability to rename their Pokemon, with the caveat that Pokemon received through trades could not be renamed. The service was delivered through an NPC who assessed the original name before offering the option to replace it, which was a small piece of character expression embedded in what was essentially a utility function. The Name Raider's opinions about names ranged across different dialogue depending on what the name was, though the game's ability to evaluate names was limited by the variety of possible inputs. Players who gave their Pokemon unusual or personal names and then visited the Name Raider sometimes found that the response was comically misaligned with their intent, which was a feature of the interaction that the game could not have designed for, but that emerged naturally from the combination of NPC dialogue and player choice. The Sylph Company's development of the Master Ball represented a conceptual pinnacle within the Pokemon world's technology, a device that could capture any wild Pokemon without fail. The game gave the player exactly one, placed at a specific narrative moment after freeing the company from Team Rocket. The scarcity of the item and its unlimited effectiveness created one of the original game's most considered resource management decisions: which Pokemon was worth using it on. Players who had read about Mewtwo's encounter at level 70 and understood the difficulty of catching it with ordinary Pokeballs typically saved the Master Ball for that encounter. Players who had not encountered this information, or who had spent their Master Ball earlier on another Pokemon, faced the Mewtwo encounter with a significantly more difficult catching task. The design decision to give the player only one Master Ball was consistent with the game's general philosophy of making certain items scarce enough that their use carried consequence. Rare candies, which instantly advanced a Pokemon one level, were found in specific hidden locations throughout the region and could not be purchased. Ethers and elixirs, which restored Move PP, appeared in specific spots and were available from the Game Corner's coin exchange, but not from ordinary shops. The distribution of these items across the region rewarded thorough exploration and the habit of examining every object in every area, creating a secondary progression alongside the badge collection that was optional but materially beneficial for players who engaged with it. The bicycle voucher and several other key items that opened access to game features were obtained through conversations with NPCs rather than through battles or dungeon exploration, which reinforced the idea that the world contained resources accessible through social engagement rather than combat. Players who spoke to every NPCs they encountered accumulated a set of useful items and information that those who focused only on battle would not have. The game never announced this as a strategy, but it rewarded it consistently enough that players who adopted the habit found their journeys materially easier than those who treated NPCs as background decoration. Pokemon breeding formally introduced in later generations, was absent from the original Kanto games, which meant that the only way to obtain a specific Pokémon was to find and catch one in the wild, receive one through a trade, or evolve one caught at an earlier stage. This constraint shaped team composition in ways later games did not require. Players could not customize the moves their Pokémon hatched knowing, could not chain inherited abilities across generations, and could not produce large numbers of identical Pokémon with optimized hidden statistics. Every Pokémon in a Kanto party was a specific individual caught at a specific moment in a specific location, and that specificity gave each one a kind of history that mass-produced breeding-optimized teams in later games lacked. The absence of abilities in the original generation similarly flattened the distinction between individuals of the same species. Two Geodude of the same level, trained on the same moves, were mechanically identical in a way that later games, with abilities that might differ between individuals, did not permit. This meant that team construction was primarily a question of species, level, and moveset, without the additional layer of individual variation that abilities and later mechanics introduced. The simplicity was a feature of the original generation's design rather than a limitation of ambition, reflecting a game built around accessible mechanics that could be understood quickly and engaged with immediately. The hidden statistics that later became known as individual values existed in the original games in a form that was not accessible to players through any in-game means, governing small variations in each Pokémon's final stats without any display or explanation. Players in the original generation were unaware of these hidden values in most cases, and the competitive practices that later emerged around selecting Pokémon with optimal values were absent from the original game's culture. This meant that the original Kanto competitive environment, to the extent it existed, operated on a different basis of team construction than later generations, relying on level, movesets, and type planning, rather than the optimization of hidden biological statistics. The Pokémon world's geography implied a scale that the game's traversal time did not reflect. Routes between cities, described in terms of a day's walk by NPCs, took seconds to cross during play, and the mountains and caves that appeared substantial on the map were navigable in minutes. This compression of geographic scale was a design necessity that the game did not attempt to explain, trusting players to understand the representation as a model of space rather than a simulation of it. The same compression applied to the implied size of cities. Celadon and Saffron, described as major urban centers with department stores and corporate headquarters, contained perhaps a dozen buildings each in the game's map representation. The compression created a world that felt larger than it was while playing and different from what one might imagine while reading the Pokédex entries about creatures that lived in specific ecological niches across the region. A Pokémon described as inhabiting remote mountain ranges was a 15-second walk from the nearest city in the game's compressed geography, which required a kind of dual awareness in players, accepting the game's spatial representation as a tool while imagining the described world as something larger and more expansive. The best players of the original games developed this dual awareness naturally, reading the Pokédex entries as descriptions of a real ecological world while navigating the game's compressed maps as a symbolic representation of that world. The implication of travel between regions, glimpsed through the SS Anne's arrival and departure, and through references to other places in NPC dialogue, suggested that Kanto was one part of a larger world whose other regions were not yet accessible, but whose existence was acknowledged. Players who picked up on these references could sense the edges of the world extending beyond what the game's maps contained, which created a quality of anticipation for what might exist beyond the accessible borders. That anticipation was eventually satisfied in Pokemon Gold and Silver, which introduced the Johto region and made travel to Kanto a feature of the post-game, but in the original games, it existed only as suggestion, which was its own form of world building through implication. The Pokemon world's approach to conflict was one of the more interesting philosophical aspects of the original game's design. Battles between trainers were universally consensual in the sense that both parties were assumed to have agreed to the encounter. Wild Pokemon battles were framed as necessary components of the catching process rather than as acts of harm. Team Rocket's activities were presented as clearly wrong, not primarily because they involved Pokemon battles, but because they involved coercion, theft, and the exploitation of Pokemon for profit without their apparent cooperation. The moral distinction the game drew between acceptable and unacceptable relationships with Pokemon was not between battle and non-battle, but between willing partnership and exploitation. This distinction was never spelled out explicitly, but was embedded in the contrast between the trainer-protagonist's journey, characterized by voluntary encounters, and Pokemon who followed their trainers willingly, and Team Rocket's operations, characterized by forcible capture, imprisonment, and the sale of Pokemon for parts. Players absorbed this distinction through the difference in how each mode of engagement was framed by the game's language, the protagonist's battling presented as adventure, and the antagonist's activities presented as crimes. The moral framework operated through implication and contrast rather than through direct instruction, which made it more effective as an embedded value system than explicit didacticism would have been. Professor Oak's speech at the beginning of the game, brief as it was, established the tone of this relationship from the start. He described a world in which humans and Pokemon lived in close partnership, in which people caught wild Pokemon to train and raise them, in which the knowledge of Pokemon was a shared cultural value worth pursuing. The game never asked players to consider whether this world was just, which was appropriate for an adventure built around participation rather than critique. But the details it offered about the world's operation, accumulated across Pokédex entries, NPC dialogue, and the contrast with Team Rocket's activities, sketched a complex enough picture that players who looked for complexity could find it. The encounter with Articuno in Seafoam Islands was one of the original game's most carefully staged legendary moments, the environment doing much of the emotional preparation before the creature itself appeared. Seafoam Islands was accessible only through the surf ability and could not be reached until relatively late in the game's progression. Its interior required a boulder puzzle to slow the underground current, and the descent through multiple floors of cave environment established a quality of depth and remoteness that made the eventual chamber feel genuinely apart from the world above. Players who arrived at Articuno's location had passed through a series of spaces designed to feel increasingly isolated, and the legendary bird waiting in that deepest chamber seemed appropriate to a place so deliberately difficult to reach. The legendary Pokemon in the original games shared a property that distinguished them from ordinary catchable Pokemon. They appeared only once in each save file, and fainting them during the encounter made them permanently unavailable for the rest of that playthrough. This irreversibility was not announced before the encounter began, which meant that players who fainted a legendary Pokemon through inexperience or bad luck would not have another opportunity within the same game. The loss was not catastrophic in terms of the game's completion, since no legendary was required to finish the story, but it was felt as a genuine consequence by players who understood what they had failed to catch and could not recover. The practice of saving the game immediately before a legendary encounter, allowing the player to reload if the creature fled or fainted, was a player-developed strategy that emerged from the recognition of irreversibility. It was never suggested by the game and required awareness of both the save mechanic and the encounter's unique status. Players who discovered this practice through discussion with others or through their own understanding of how save files worked, carried it as a piece of knowledge that gave them a second chance at moments the game designed to be unrepeatable, which was its own small form of player-created agency within a system that otherwise offered none. The Pokémon who could only be obtained through trades with NPCs within the game rather than through player-to-player link cable trades occupied a specific category of early memory for players who spent time in those cities. The Raichu obtainable through the Celadon Game Corner's coin exchange was not technically a trade, but a direct coin-for-creature transaction, while the in-game trades in various cities provided specific Pokémon with specific nickname histories attached. Receiving a Pokémon with a name given by its fictional previous owner created a kind of provenance for the creature, a history implied by the name it already carried when it arrived. The traded Pokémon's faster experience gained below a certain level threshold gave these in-game trades a mechanical benefit alongside whatever appeal the specific creature held. Players who received a Jinx in Cerulean or a Golem through the link cable from a friend were holding a Pokémon that would grow more quickly in the early training periods, accelerating toward whatever role it was intended to fill in the team. The mechanic was subtle enough that many players never consciously identified it as a reason to prefer traded Pokémon, but it was present in every playthrough, quietly influencing the pace of development for creatures obtained through that method. The Pokémon League's building was architecturally unlike anything else in Kanto, its design suggesting a specific function rather than the general-purpose structures of most game buildings. The 4 chambers leading to the champion were each populated by a single Elite Four member and their team, the rooms between battles offering no healing and no exit, creating a sustained challenge environment that differed fundamentally from the route-by-route progression of the main journey. Players who entered the league building well prepared moved through it as a culminating test of everything the journey had taught. Those who entered underprepared experienced it as an education in what was still missing from their approach. The absence of music between Elite Four battles in some versions of the game, or the transition between different battle themes, contributed to the psychological experience of the gauntlet. Players who had listened to the battle music across hundreds of encounters throughout the game heard those same themes now at the threshold of completion, which gave them an accumulated weight that novelty alone could not have produced. The music that had accompanied early trainer battles in Viridian City, heard again in the Champion's Chamber, connected the ending to the beginning through a shared auditory vocabulary, reminding players that everything they were experiencing had grown from those first few routes outside Pallet Town. Blue's team composition as champion reflected something interesting about how the rival's journey had been structured in parallel with the player's own. His party included his starter's final evolution, a Pokémon whose type was strong against the player's starter, which meant the final battle always included a direct reminder of the original choice made in Professor Oak's laboratory. The player who had chosen Charmander faced Blastoise. The player who had chosen Bulbasaur faced Charizard. The player who had chosen Squirtle faced Venusaur. The parallel was structural, embedded in the game's code rather than in any explicit narrative, and players who noticed it experienced a moment of recognition that transformed a mechanical observation into something that felt meaningful. Kanto's routes carried names as well as numbers, though the names were rarely displayed during ordinary play and were known primarily through the game's manual and later through guide resources. Route 1 was simply Route 1, but other routes had names that reflected their character. The cycling road with its downhill gradient, the underwater tunnels, the ocean routes that stretched between Cinnabar and Pallet. The naming system created a geographic language for the region that existed regardless of whether individual players engaged with it, a background infrastructure of place names that supported the world's sense of having been established before the player arrived. The towns themselves had names tied to gems and minerals in the Japanese originals, a naming convention that carried partially into international releases. Pallet Town, its name a creative adaptation of the palette concept, Pewter City, Cerulean City, Vermilion, Lavender, Celadon, Fuchsia, Saffron, Cinnabar. Each name carried a color association, some explicit and some subtle, that gave the region's geography a unified chromatic language. Players who noticed the pattern had a way of understanding the towns as a collection rather than as individual locations, which was consistent with how the game presented the gym challenge as a collection effort, moving through a set toward completion. The final moments of the original game's main story, the credits sequence and the Hall of Fame registration, were brief enough that some players who had expected a more extended conclusion felt slightly surprised by their restraint. The games did not linger. The credits rolled, the Pokémon were registered, and the player was returned to Pallet Town with everything they had built still intact and the world still open. The ending was not a terminus but a transition, the narrative conclusion giving way to the open time of the post-game without announcement or separation. The transition was itself the conclusion statement. This was not an ending, only a change in the nature of what came next. The quiet that settles after the champion is defeated is one of the most distinctive experiences the original Kanto games offered. Not the quiet of an empty world, but the quiet of a full one, all its roots and caves and water tiles still populated, all its NPCs still in their positions with their original dialogue, all its hidden items still waiting in their unmarked tiles. The world had not responded to the player's achievement with any visible change, which meant that the achievement existed entirely in what the player carried, the knowledge of what had been done, the team that had done it, and the opened awareness that the region now held in a different relationship to the journey that had just concluded. That unchanged world, identical in its surface features to what it had been before the champion battle, was what Kanto always offered, a place that persisted, that held still, that remained available regardless of what the player had accomplished or failed to accomplish within it. The tall grass continued to hold its Pokémon. The caves continued to generate their encounters. The roots continued to connect their towns in the same directions they always had. And somewhere in all of that unchanged persistence, in the roots walked many times, and the centers visited at each small emergency, and the roots that led finally to the place where the rival sat in the champion's chair, was the record of a journey that the game preserved not in its maps, but in the team that the player had assembled and raised and carried to the end. Thanks for watching. If these quiet details helped you relax, there's another video waiting on the left of your screen. You can let it play as you close your eyes. You might hear something soothing before you fall asleep again.